Hey, welcome back. Or maybe welcome for the very first time. Either way, I am really glad you're here tonight. So before we dive in together, let me ask you something kind of strange. When was the last time you experienced true darkness? Not, I forgot to turn on the hallway light darkness. I mean the kind where you hold your hand 6 inches from your face and you cannot see it. Because 700 years ago, every single person living in a medieval town faced that exact moment. Every single night. And what they did in the hours leading up to it and what happened after is honestly one of the most fascinating, most human, most quietly extraordinary stories you've probably never been told. Tonight that changes. And before we begin, I want to say something genuine. If this kind of storytelling is what you've been looking for at the end of a long day, then do me a small favor, hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. Not because I'm asking you to, but because if you enjoy what I put together here, that little gesture tells me to keep going, keep digging through history and keep bringing you more nights like this one. Drop a comment too, tell me where you are right now, what time it is, maybe what you're drinking. There is something special about knowing that people all over the world are listening to the same story at the same moment. Now dim your lights if you can, get comfortable, and let's go back together. Imagine England. The year is somewhere in the middle of the 14th century, let us say around the year 1340. The Black Death has not yet arrived. That horror is still a few years away. For now the world is mostly intact. You are standing at the edge of a market town. Not London, not Paris, nothing grand. Just a modest town of perhaps 4,000 souls tucked inside a low stone wall somewhere in the English countryside. 4,000 people sounds small, doesn't it? But in the 14th century, a town like that was genuinely significant. Most people in England at that time lived in villages of fewer than 300. A town of 4,000 was a city to them, a place of trade, opportunity, noise, and possibility. And right now, in the middle of our story, the sun is beginning to set. Let's slow down here for a moment, because I want you to actually feel this, not just understand it. The sky above the town has turned the colour of embers, oranges and deep reds bleeding into something darker. The kind of sunset that today we might photograph and post somewhere. But in the 14th century, nobody was admiring the view. That sky was a clock, and it was telling everyone the same urgent thing. Hurry up, wrap it up, get inside, because once that light was gone, it was truly completely terrifyingly gone. Now the town around you is wrapping up the day in a way that probably looks a little familiar, and then suddenly very much doesn't. The market stalls are being dismantled. Merchants, their hands rough and their feet sore from standing since before sunrise, are folding linen, stacking pottery, loading the last of their goods onto carts. The bread seller has been up since 3 in the morning. The wool merchant has been on his feet for 14 hours, and neither of them is complaining exactly because this is simply what a day is. From the research of historian Ian Mortimer, who spent years reconstructing daily life in medieval England, we know that most working people in a 14th century town began their day at first light and ended it at dusk, not by choice, by necessity. Because everything revolved around natural light. There were no street lamps, no electric signs glowing over shop windows, no warm yellow light spilling from a phone in your pocket. When the sun went down, the town went dark, and that was not a metaphor. Now here's something that might genuinely surprise you. You might picture a medieval town as chaotic and wild, and honestly, during the day it kind of was. The streets were narrow, sometimes so narrow that the upper floors of buildings on opposite sides almost touched overhead, blocking the sky entirely. The smells were, let's say, enthusiastic. Tanneries, butchers waste from the shambles and the ever-present perfume of animals who had no idea they were living in a town. One historical record from Paris in the 13th century mentions street names, actual official street names, that reference human waste so directly that I am going to let your imagination fill in the blank. England was no different. But here's the thing. During the day, all of that noise, all of that chaos, all of that rich and overwhelming life, it was managed. People knew the rules. They knew their lanes, their neighbours, their routines. But as the light began to fade, the rules started to change. The first signal came from the church. At sunset, the bells would ring what was called Vespers, the evening prayer hour. In the medieval world, time was not measured in minutes or seconds. The church bells were the town's only public clock, and those bells governed everything when you worked, when you prayed, when you ate, and crucially when you were expected to be off the street. The historian C.M. Woolgar, in his study of the senses in late medieval England, describes how sound carried in a way that is almost impossible for us to imagine today. In a world with no machinery, no traffic, no background hum of electricity, a church bell could be heard from several miles away. Everyone in the town heard it, and everyone knew exactly what it meant. Now, in the minutes after Vespers rang, there was a kind of beautiful quiet choreography happening all across the town. Mothers called children in from the streets, apprentices put away their tools, tavern keepers, and there were quite a few of them, began the careful process of deciding which customers were welcome to linger inside, and which ones were about to become someone else's problem. The heavy wooden gates at the town's entrances were swung shut and barred. That last detail is worth sitting with for a moment. The gates were closed. Once the sun went down, you were either inside the walls or you were outside of them. And being outside a medieval town's walls after dark was not a pleasant situation to be in. There were no police in the modern sense. The roads beyond the gates were unlit, unpatrolled, and shared with people you very much did not want to meet. Inside the walls, at least, there was something. Warmth, community, order, fragile, imperfect order, but order nonetheless. And in the last light of that fading day, if you stood in the centre of the market square and just listened, you would hear the town doing something almost tender, slowing down, the cartwheels going quieter, the shouting of traders fading, somewhere the sound of a lute drifting out from behind a tavern door, the smell of wood smoke thickening in the air as hearth fires were stoked for the night. And underneath all of it, underneath the winding down and the closing up and the hurrying home, a kind of collective breath being held. Because everyone in this town, every one of those 4,000 souls knew something that most of us have completely forgotten. The night was coming, and the night in the medieval world was a different country, different rules, different dangers, different fears, and different magic too if you knew where to look. That hour before dark, that liminal space between the last golden light and the first real darkness, it was perhaps the most charged hour of the entire day. More things happened in those 60 minutes than we might ever guess, and one of them, a single sound that would travel over the rooftops and change the behaviour of every person in this town, is where our story goes next. There is a word you have used your whole life, probably hundreds of times, without ever stopping to wonder where it came from. Think about it for a second. Your parents said it to you when you were a teenager. Maybe you've said it yourself. Maybe you heard it on the news during a storm or a crisis, when authorities told people to be off the streets by a certain hour. The word is curfew. And tonight, I want to tell you what it actually means. Because once you know the real story behind it, the sound that started it, the king who weaponized it, and the quiet genius hidden inside it, you will never hear that word the same way again. Let's go back to our town. The sun has fully set now. The last orange has drained from the sky, and somewhere in the centre of the town, rising above the rooftops, above the smell of smoke and the murmur of evening conversations, the church bell begins to ring. Not the gentle rhythm of the Vespers hour we heard before, This is something different. This is deeper, more deliberate. Each stroke measured and heavy like a slow heartbeat. 8 strikes, 8 o'clock in the evening, and every single person in this town, from the wool merchant putting away his ledger to the baker's wife banking her kitchen fire, to the apprentice sneaking a final sip of ale, every one of them stops what they are doing. Because they know what that bell means. That bell is what we now call the curfew bell. And the word curfew, which you've heard 1,000 times, comes directly from the old French phrase couvre-feu. 2 words, couvrir to cover, feu fire, cover fire. That is it. That is all it means. The curfew bell was not originally about controlling people's bedtimes. It was not about keeping teenagers off the street. It was not even at its core about law enforcement. It was about fire. And in a medieval town built almost entirely of timber, with thatched roofs dried by the summer sun, and hearths burning at the centre of every single home, fire was not just a danger. Fire was the end of the world. Think about what the inside of a typical 14th century home actually looked like. Not the stone castles you might picture. Those were for the wealthy few. Most people lived in low, cramped, timber-framed buildings, with wattle and daub walls, essentially a mixture of mud, straw and animal dung pressed over woven sticks. And the fire, the single source of heat and cooking for the entire household, burned in a pit in the centre of the earthen floor, with a hole in the roof above it to let the smoke escape. No chimney, no grate, no fire screen, just an open flame in the middle of your living room. And the floor around it covered in rushes and dried herbs to mask the smell of daily life, which incidentally also meant the floor was essentially a carpet of kindling. When you picture that, really picture it, you understand why the curfew bell was not a suggestion, it was survival. Now here is where history gets genuinely interesting. Because the curfew was not invented in the medieval period. Versions of it existed long before. But the man who made it famous, the man who turned it from a local fire safety custom into a law with teeth, was a king, and his motives were not entirely about keeping buildings standing. His name was William, King of England from the year 1066, and history knows him as William the Conqueror. 2 years after the Battle of Hastings in 1068, William issued a decree across England. Every evening at the ringing of the 8 o'clock bell, all fires were to be covered, all candles extinguished, all lights put out, and all people were to be inside their homes, under severe penalties for those who disobeyed. Now you might think that sounds reasonable, fire prevention for a timber-built nation, and you would be right. But there was a second reason William was so passionate about this. You see, William was a Norman. He had just invaded and conquered a country full of Anglo-Saxons, who were understandably not particularly delighted about the situation. There were a lot of Saxons who wanted to gather in the dark, plan resistance, share grievances, and perhaps organise something that William would prefer they did not organise. So William did something quietly brilliant. He took a practical fire safety rule, one that already existed in parts of Europe, and he weaponised it. The historian William Andrews, writing about this period, noted that William, under severe penalties, prohibited the use of fire or candles when the curfew bell should ring to prevent associations and conspiracies. And one chronicler of the time, recording the Saxon reaction to this law, described the curfew bell as something the English heard as the knell of their departed liberty. That is a stunning phrase, isn't it, a knell of departed liberty? Because the Saxons understood what was happening. The bell was not just about fire, it was about control. Get everyone off the streets, keep them in their homes, make darkness itself an instrument of governance. I find myself thinking about this every time I hear the word curfew in the modern world. That we're still using a 1,000-year-old Norman word from a law passed by a conqueror, trying to pacify a population he had just defeated. Language is a time machine sometimes, but let me tell you about the actual device, because this part is something almost nobody talks about, and it is genuinely wonderful. The couvre-feu was not just a law, it was also a physical object. Wealthy households owned a metal dome roughly the shape of a shield or a large bowl which could be placed directly over the burning embers of the hearth at night. The dome had vents, small holes or slits cut into the sides, and this was the genius of it. The fire was not fully extinguished. The embers could smoulder through the night, slowly breathing just enough through those vents to stay alive. And in the morning, when the curfew lifted, a servant with a bellows could coax the coals back into flame within minutes. No need to find dry kindling. No need to strike flint and steel in the cold and dark of an early morning. The fire was waiting for you. Poorer families could not afford the metal version. They used terracotta, simple unglazed clay covers baked hard, some of them plain, some of them surprisingly beautiful with carved patterns. You can still find examples of these in European museums today. And less wealthy families, still those who could afford, neither simply did what the law required, rake the ashes over the embers by hand, hoping for the best. The rich covered their fire with an elegant dome. The poor covered it with their bare hands. I think there is something almost poetic about that image. It tells you everything about medieval society in one small gesture. Now here is a detail I absolutely love, and you might want to remember this for a pub quiz someday. In medieval Venice, one of the great cities of Europe, the curfew law applied to almost everyone in the city. Almost. There was one neighbourhood that was specifically exempted. The barbers' quarter. Why? Because in medieval Venice, barbers were also surgeons. If someone was sick in the night, bleeding feverish in pain, you needed the barber to be awake and accessible. You needed a light burning in that window. So the law, which applied to merchants and nobles and craftsmen and priests, made a small practical exception for the people who stitched up wounds and pulled infected teeth at midnight. I love that. I love that somewhere in Venice 700 years ago, someone sat down and thought, yes, the fire law is important, but not if it means someone bleeds out in the dark because the surgeon's candle is out. Common sense medieval style. Now let's talk about what actually happened when the bell rang and people did not comply. Because the enforcement of the curfew was, and I want to be fair here and consistent, during the reign of William the Conqueror and his son William II, scholars tell us the law was rigidly enforced. You kept your light out, full stop. But by the time of Henry I, who came to power in the year 1100, the absolute prohibition was quietly relaxed. Henry repealed the strictest version of the law, and the curfew settled, as one historian put it, into a cherished custom. Which is a delightful phrase. It means people kept ringing the bell, people kept covering their fires, but the penalty for a lit candle at 9 o'clock was no longer necessarily a visit from the king's men. Still, if the night watchmen who began their patrols once the bell had rung saw a light burning in a window after curfew, you had questions to answer. And the night watchmen were not, let's say, the most professional organisation in the medieval world. Historical records show that they were typically local citizens, assigned on rotation to patrol the streets. Armed with lanterns and long poles, sometimes halberds, sometimes just heavy sticks, they were expected to check anyone they found moving in the dark. And those records also show with wonderful honesty that watchmen were frequently found asleep, frequently found inside alehouses drinking and taking tobacco all night long, as one 17th century record puts it, and frequently known to demand small sums of money from people who had the bad luck to stumble into them after dark, letting them pass in exchange for a coin or two. Corruption also medieval. But here is what I think is the most remarkable thing about the curfew bell. Long after it lost its legal force, long after Henry I softened the law, long after the actual danger of a fire spreading through thatched rooftops became somewhat less existential, the bell kept ringing. Not because anyone made it ring, but because people wanted it to. The town of Sandwich in the county of Kent in England, the same Sandwich that gave its name to the food you probably had for lunch last Tuesday, still rings a curfew bell today. Every evening at 8 o'clock, the bell at St. Peter's Church rings for 10 minutes. It has done so for centuries, not because of a law, not because William the Conqueror is watching, but because a town decided that the sound of that bell tolling at the edge of night was a part of who they were. Voltaire, the great French philosopher of the 18th century, not a man known for his nostalgia, once called the curfew bell an ancient police on fire protection in the Northern Hemisphere. High praise from a man who spent most of his time being brilliantly skeptical of everything. Think about what a bell like that must have sounded like on a quiet evening. No engines, no traffic, no hum of electricity, just the town settling into the dark. And somewhere high above the rooftops, those 8 heavy strokes rolling out across the roof tiles and the muddy lanes in the market square. The poet Thomas Gray, writing in the 18th century, looking back at a world already fading from memory, opened what became one of the most famous poems in the English language with this image. The curfew, he wrote, tolls the knell of parting day. The knell of parting day. Day was dying, and the bell was its farewell. So the next time you're out at night, standing on a street corner, watching the city move around you in all its lit-up, never-stopping, thoroughly electric glory, take a moment and think about what it would have been like to hear that bell. 8 strokes, 8 o'clock. And the choice in front of you: go home and cover your fire or stay out in the dark and answer for it. Most people chose wisely, but the ones who stayed out, the ones who had to stay out or who wanted to stay out or who had no choice at all, they walked into a town that was about to become a different place entirely. Because the curfew bell did not just signal the end of the day, it signaled the beginning of something else. Something that terrified medieval people far more than any law, any watchman, any fine. And that something, the reason no one in a wooden medieval town ever went to sleep without covering their fire, is exactly where we're going next. Soot. That is the smell you would notice first. Not in the dramatic everything is burning way you might imagine. Just a quiet, ever-present layer of it sitting on the walls, clinging to the curtains, resting in the folds of your clothing. In a medieval town, soot was as ordinary as dust. You lived inside it. You breathed it. You stopped noticing it the same way city people today stop noticing exhaust fumes. But on certain nights, certain particular wind-blown dry summer nights, that smell would change. It would sharpen. And when it did, every single person in the town felt it in their chest before they understood it in their mind. Something was burning. We need to talk about fire. Not the cozy fireside warming kind we romanticize in movies. Not the gentle hearth glow we imagined covering with a dome of terracotta last chapter. We need to talk about the fire that medieval people feared more than plague, more than war, more than the horsemen of any apocalypse they could name. Because the truth is, in the daily lived experience of the average person in a 14th century town, it was not a sword that posed the most constant, most indiscriminate, most annihilating threat. It was a candle knocked sideways at the wrong moment. Let me put some numbers in front of you, because the scale of what fire could do to a medieval town is almost impossible to comprehend without them. Between the year 764 and the year 1227, the City of London alone suffered at least 15 major fires. 15 in roughly 4.5 centuries. That averages out to a catastrophic city-damaging fire every 30 years. Which means that in the lifetime of any given medieval Londoner, who if they survived childhood might live to 40 or 50 years old, they could reasonably expect to live through at least one fire that fundamentally changed the shape of the city around them. Not a house fire, not a workshop burning, a fire that changed the city. The one I want to tell you about tonight happened on the 10th of July 1212. Not the famous Great Fire of London, the one everyone knows from 1666 with Samuel Pepys burying his cheese in the garden. No, this one is the forgotten fire, the one that happened 4.5 centuries earlier when London was smaller and more vulnerable and almost entirely made of wood. It started on the south bank of the River Thames in the neighbourhood of Southwark. The exact cause has been lost to time. Contemporary chroniclers suggest it may have begun in a bakery, or perhaps in the home of a wealthy merchant, though nobody knows for certain. What happened next is recorded in a document called the Liber de Antiqui Legibus, the Book of Ancient Laws, written about 60 years after the event. In this year was the Great Fire of Southwark, and it burned the Church of St Mary and also the bridge with the chapel there and the great part of the city. That one sentence carries such weight, doesn't it? It burned the church. It burned the bridge. It burned the great part of the city. But the London Bridge is where the story becomes something else entirely. You have to understand what London Bridge was in 1212. It was not simply a crossing point over the River Thames. It was a community, built of stone, which was unusual and expensive, and meant the bridge itself survived the flames. But what stood on top of the bridge was a dense higgledy-piggledy warren of wooden shops and houses stacked multiple stories high, pressed together so tightly on both sides that they almost met overhead. People lived on this bridge. Merchants sold goods on it. There were mills, there were toilets that dropped waste directly into the river below. There were chapels and children and arguments and laundry. London Bridge in 1212 was not infrastructure. It was a neighbourhood that happened to be balanced over moving water. And on the 10th of July 1212 it became a trap. The fire on the south bank drove thousands of people toward the bridge. Their instinct, understandably, was to get across the river to reach safety on the other side. But then, driven by the wind, burning embers crossed the Thames and ignited the northern end of the bridge as well. The people on the bridge found themselves caught between two fires. A later account, written in 1603 by the historian John Stowe, records the death toll on London Bridge alone as 3,000 people. 3,000. In a city whose entire population was perhaps 50,000 at the time. Modern historians debate the figure, some argue it is an exaggeration, but even the skeptics agree that what happened on London Bridge that July was catastrophic, and that the damage to the structure was so severe it remained only partly usable for years afterwards. 3,000 people on a bridge, trapped between fire on both sides. I will confess something to you. I've spent years reading about medieval history, and this specific story is one that stays with me, because there is something about the geometry of it that is uniquely terrible. Those people ran toward what they thought was safety. They followed their instincts perfectly, and the fire outthought them. It came around, it got ahead of them, and they realized, standing on a bridge over a cold river with smoke on both sides, that there was nowhere left to go. That is the thing about fire in a world of wood and wind. It does not follow rules. London, 1212, is the most dramatic example, but it was far from isolated. The German city of Lübeck, a prosperous trading hub in the north of the country, burned catastrophically in the year 1157, entirely destroyed. It was rebuilt, and then it burned again in 1251, and then, adding injury to insult, it burned again in 1276, 3 times in roughly 120 years. After the third fire, the city of Lübeck developed what historians now describe as one of the earliest and most comprehensive fire safety systems in medieval Europe. Stone construction, mandated in key areas, organized response protocols, designated water sources. You sometimes learn things the easy way, and sometimes you need to lose your city 3 times before the lesson sinks in. So how exactly did a medieval town fight a fire? This is the part where modern people tend to assume there was simply nothing, that people just watched helplessly while their world burned. And that is not entirely fair. There were methods, organised, thoughtful, genuinely earnest methods. They just happened to be deeply heartbreakingly inadequate against any serious blaze. The primary tool was the leather bucket. These were exactly what they sound like, buckets made of thick cowhide stitched around a rope handle stored in the parish church along with other fire response equipment. Every significant church in a medieval town was also in a practical sense the local emergency depot. When a fire broke out and the alarm was raised, usually by shouting, sometimes by ringing the church bell in a specific pattern that everyone in the town recognized as the fire alarm distinct from the curfew, bell distinct from the prayer hours, the response was immediate and communal. People ran, not away from the fire, toward it. Because in a medieval town, your neighbour's burning house was your house burning 30 seconds from now. The bucket brigade formed two lines of people stretching from the nearest water source to the edge of the fire, one line passing full buckets forward, the other returning empty ones to be refilled. And here is the thing nobody likes to say about bucket brigades. They worked. Sort of. Against small fires contained fires, a single room, a workshop corner. Against a fire that had been burning for 20 minutes in a dry July wind, they were handing teacups to the ocean. Beyond the buckets, there was a second tool that sounds almost counterintuitive until you think about it. The fire hook. A long pole, sometimes 10 or 15 feet in length, with an iron hook at the end. The purpose of the fire hook was not to fight the fire directly. It was to destroy buildings ahead of the fire. The logic was brutal and clear-eyed. You cannot outpace fire with water, but you can deny fire its fuel. If you could tear down the building next to the burning one, pull the roof off, collapse the walls, you created a gap, an empty space, a fire break. The fire would reach that gap, find nothing to consume, and in theory stop. In practice, it depended entirely on the wind. If the wind was gentle, fire breaks worked. Medieval towns survived because of this technique. If the wind was strong, burning embers leapt the gap, and the men standing there with their long iron hooks had done nothing but waste time they did not have. There is a detail from the Great Fire of London, the famous one in 1666, not 1212, that has always struck me as quietly devastating. The Lord Mayor of London, a man named Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken in the early hours of the 2nd of September to be told that a fire had broken out in a bakery on Pudding Lane. He went to see it, assess the situation, and then delivered what has gone down as perhaps the most catastrophically wrong judgment in the history of municipal management. He said, and I am paraphrasing here, but barely that a woman could put it out herself. Then he went back to bed. By the time large-scale fire-break demolitions were finally ordered, the wind had turned a bakery fire into a firestorm that consumed 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches and St. Paul's Cathedral. The lesson that the medieval world has been trying to teach for 500 years, act immediately, act decisively, destroy ahead of the flames, was delivered with full force once again. Some lessons just refuse to be learned the easy way, but here is something that I find genuinely moving about how medieval communities responded to fire beyond the heroism and the chaos. After a major fire, the rebuilding was communal in a way that we have largely lost. Neighbours did not watch from across the road and wait for insurance assessors. They picked up timber, they mixed plaster, they carried thatch. Records from various English towns show that after significant fires surrounding communities, sometimes from villages miles away, sent materials, labour and money. Not because they were required to, but because everyone understood in their bones that a burning town was a warning to every other town. It was us today, it could be you next summer. There is something in that collective response that shared immediate wordless understanding of mutual vulnerability that I find genuinely beautiful. Even in the ashes, by the time we reached the 14th century, the larger towns and cities of Europe were beginning to experiment with building regulations. Thatched roofs were periodically banned and periodically ignored. Stone construction was encouraged and mostly unaffordable. Some cities designated specific streets or areas as fire breaks by design wider lanes, where buildings were set back slightly from one another. And almost everywhere, the storage of firefighting equipment in parish churches became standard practice. Ladders, hooks, buckets, axes inventoried, maintained ready. It was not enough. It was never quite enough. But it was the beginning of the idea that a city had a responsibility to protect itself, that safety was not just individual luck but collective architecture. An idea, incidentally, that took another 400 years and several more catastrophic fires before it was truly implemented. And so on our quiet evening in our 14th century town, the curfew bell has rung. The fires are covered, the streets are beginning to empty. And if you were standing in one of those narrow lanes right now watching a neighbour rake the ash carefully over the coals with a practised hand, you would understand without needing to be told why she's so thorough about it. Why she checks it twice, why she does not go to sleep until she is completely, absolutely certain, because she has seen fire before in this town or in a story passed down from her mother or from her mother before that, and she knows exactly what it looks like when a town forgets to be careful. The ashes are covered, the streets are growing quiet, and in the gathering dark there is one last warm light left burning in this town perfectly legally, perfectly purposefully. It is glowing from behind a thick wooden door, spilling a little out under the frame, accompanied by the low sound of voices and something that might be a lute. The door of the tavern is not quite shut, and if you lean in just slightly, if you tilt your ear toward that warm yellow crack of light, you can already hear the evening beginning its second life. Push that door open. Go on. You've been standing outside in the dark for long enough, smelling the ash and the mud and the cold night air, watching the fires get covered and the lanes empty out. The curfew bell has rung. The world has closed itself down. But this door is still fractionally open, and on the other side of it is warmth and noise and the smell of something fermented and deeply human. Welcome to the medieval alehouse. Before we go any further, I want to clear up a confusion that trips almost everyone up. Because when most people hear the words medieval tavern, they picture a single type of place, rough-hewn tables, big mugs, a fire, a brawl in the corner. Some sort of generic watering hole from Hollywood's imagination. But in 14th century England there were actually 3 distinct types of drinking establishments, and they were as different from each other as a corner bar, a wine bar, and a hotel bar are today. The alehouse was the most common. It was often literally someone's home, a room, or a few rooms where a woman who had brewed more ale than her household needed opened her door to paying customers. Ale only. Sometimes bread and cheese, mostly poor to middling customers, often run on a completely informal basis. The tavern was a step up in status. Taverns specialized in wine, primarily imported red wine from Bordeaux in France, and they catered to merchants, professionals, and the better off. Wine was expensive. If you were drinking wine at a medieval tavern, you were making a statement about your income. And the inn was different again, primarily accommodation with food and drink as supporting services. Inns were for travellers. They had stabling for horses, rooms sometimes shared between strangers, and the kind of clientele who were going somewhere rather than simply sitting still. The place we're about to enter is an alehouse, and the person who runs it is, as most alehouse keepers in the 14th century were, a woman. Her name, let us say, is Marjorie. She's somewhere in her 40s with strong arms from years of lifting grain sacks and stirring brewing vats. Her hair is bundled under a white linen coif. Her apron is perpetually ale-stained in a pattern she has long since stopped noticing, and outside her door, tucked above the frame, not a painted sign, not a carved wooden board, but a bundle of green branches tied together, hangs what served the 14th century as the universal advertisement for ale sold here. The ale stake, or sometimes a broom. No words necessary. Everyone who passed knew what it meant. When Marjorie had a fresh batch ready, the green bundle went up. When the ale was gone or spoiled, the bundle came down. This is not charming medieval quaintness. This is a functional communication system in a world where most customers could not read. Now here is the thing about medieval ale that surprises almost everyone who learns it. Marjorie's ale is not what you are picturing. It has no hops. Hops, which give modern beer its bitter preserving quality, did not arrive in England from the Low Countries until the end of the 14th century at the earliest, and were not widely adopted until well into the 15th. What Marjorie brews is a sweeter, denser, cloudier drink than anything you would find in a modern pub. It is brewed from malted barley mixed with boiling water, strained flavoured with whatever herbs are locally available, sometimes heather, sometimes sage, sometimes nettles, and left to ferment for roughly 24 hours. And here is the crucial detail: it lasts perhaps 2 or 3 days at most before it begins to sour and spoil. Which means Marjorie is not running a bar in the modern sense. She's running a hyperlocal, just-in-time distribution operation for a product that expires before the week is out. She brews, immediately she sells. Whatever she cannot sell in the next 2 days is lost. The ale taster, an official position actually required by the law, called the Assize of Bread and Ale, which had regulated the quality, price and measurement of both bread and ale across England, since approximately the year 1266 would come to inspect the batch. And if you think a government ale inspector sounds like a relatively comfortable job, you've not heard about the testing method. The ale taster would pour some of the fresh ale onto a wooden bench. He would then sit in it, in leather trousers. He would wait 3 minutes. If the leather stuck to the bench when he stood up, meaning there was too much residual sugar and fermentation had been incomplete, the ale was not yet legal to sell. If the leather did not stick, if the ale was properly fermented and the sugars adequately converted, Marjorie was cleared for business. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. The primary quality control mechanism for medieval English ale was a government official pressing his leather-covered backside onto a puddle of beer and seeing what happened. Medieval bureaucracy operated at a very particular frequency, but what went on inside past the green bundle and the low door frame, let me tell you what the alehouse actually was in the social life of a medieval town. And to explain this, I want you to think about something. In a world with no newspapers, no message boards, no postal service for ordinary people, no way to broadcast information beyond the sound of a human voice, where did you go to find out what was happening? You went to Marjorie's. The medieval alehouse was the closest thing the 14th century had to the internet. Not because it was fast, it was not fast. Rumour moved at the speed of a person walking between towns. But it was the node. It was the place where travellers arrived with news from the road, where merchants compared the prices they had gotten at different markets, where a man who had just been to the county court told the assembled room what the sheriff had decided, where a woman who had relatives in the next village shared what she had heard about the harvest there. The alehouse was the town's living memory and its daily update simultaneously. And the person at the centre of it all was Marjorie, because she was there every evening. She heard everything. She forgot nothing. She knew who owed money, who was in dispute with whom, whose marriage was in trouble, whose business was failing, and which merchants had been travelling together on the road to London last Tuesday. Historian Judith Bennett, who has written extensively about medieval English alewives, notes that the brewing records and court documents of the period reveal women like Marjorie as central figures in their communities, not simply service providers, but genuine information, brokers, community anchors, and in some cases the most knowledgeable person about local affairs in the entire town. The alehouse was her domain, and that made her quietly one of the most powerful people on the lane. Of course, power of that informal kind tends to attract official anxiety, and the medieval alehouse attracted quite a lot of it, because information flows both ways. News came into the alehouse, and it also went out. Complaints about the Lord's grain levy could be aired in Marjorie's common room in a way they could not be aired in the open street. Grievances about the price of bread, about the harvest tax, about the conduct of the bailiff, these had a place to gather and simmer in the alehouse that they did not have anywhere else. The historians note that uprisings and mobs often had their origins in medieval alehouses is not hyperbole, it is documented. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the most significant popular uprising in medieval English history, which shook the foundations of the feudal system so severely that the young King Richard II had to ride out personally to face the rebel leaders, did not emerge from thin air. It emerged from years of accumulated anger that has been talked about, shared and amplified in exactly the kind of common room we're standing in right now. Marjorie probably had opinions about all of it. She was just smart enough to keep most of them to herself. Let me tell you who is in the room tonight. Over by the fire, two wool merchants in indigo and russet cloaks are having the kind of conversation that sounds casual, but is entirely about money. They are comparing prices, they're making calculations, they're deciding between cups whether to ship their next batch to London or to wait for the market at the next fair. At the long trestle table in the centre, a group of craftsmen who have worked together all day, a carpenter, a thatcher and two journeymen stonecutters, are decompressing in the way that manual labourers have always decompressed, after physical work loudly with great enthusiasm and with considerably more arm gesturing than is strictly necessary to describe what happened at the building site this afternoon. In the corner, sitting alone with a small cup and an expression of careful neutrality, is a travelling peddler who arrived in town an hour before the gates closed. He is listening to everything. He will carry what he hears to 3 other towns before the month is out. And at the end of the room, doing something that probably involves cheating, are 2 men playing a dice game with bone dice on a worn square of leather. Marjorie is watching them. She has seen this before. Now let me tell you about the drink itself, because even if medieval ale was not the beer, we know it was something more important than a drink. It was a food. Not metaphorically, literally a food. Medieval ale was thick, cloudy, rich in grain-derived carbohydrates and B vitamins, essentially the consistency of what we might call a thin, fizzy porridge. It was sometimes called liquid bread, not as a joke, but as an accurate nutritional description. For people who burned somewhere between 3,500 and 4,500 calories a day doing physical labour, and who, as we established, got the vast majority of their calories from grain ale, was a significant part of that caloric intake. Children drank it. The weak low-alcohol version called small beer was given to children because it was safer than water from certain sources, and because it provided nutrition that mattered in a world where no one was getting quite enough of anything. By 16 centuries before the widespread adoption of hopped beer, there were more than 17,000 alehouses in England and Wales alone. 17,000. For a country of perhaps 4 million people, that is roughly 1 alehouse for every 235 people. Here is something that I find genuinely remarkable about the alewife tradition, and I want to say it carefully because it deserves care. Brewing had always been women's work. From the earliest records of the practice, centuries before our 14th century town was built, the brewing of ale in England was a domestic female occupation. Alewives like Marjorie were not exceptions or curiosities. They were the norm. They were the industry. And as the industry became more valuable as towns grew, as the demand for ale expanded, as brewing shifted from a domestic task to a commercial enterprise, something predictable happened. Men moved in. By the end of the 14th century and into the 15th, commercial brewing was becoming increasingly dominated by male-owned and male-operated businesses, particularly in larger towns where the capital investment required was beyond what most individual alewives could access. The women who remained in the trade, particularly widows and single women who had no male household partner to front their enterprise, found themselves increasingly marginalized, fined, more heavily inspected, more rigorously, and viewed with growing suspicion. And here is the detail that has always struck me as one of the more quietly unsettling threads in this whole history. The visual image of the medieval alewife stirring her bubbling pot surrounded by cats, wearing a tall pointed hat as she worked over her cauldron, bears a remarkable resemblance to the later image of the witch. This is not a coincidence. The tall pointed hat was actually a real item of clothing that some older alewives wore to make themselves visible at markets and fairs, so customers could spot the ale seller in a crowd. The bubbling cauldron was the brewing vat. The cat was a working animal kept to control the rodents that would otherwise infest the grain stores. The broomstick was the ale stake, the sign hung above the door. The stereotypical visual image of a witch, which has been embedded in Western popular culture for centuries, is quite possibly the distorted legacy of medieval misogyny applied to women who dared to run businesses that became too profitable for men to leave alone. I do not state this as absolute historical certainty. Historians debate the connections, but the overlap is real enough that it deserves more than a footnote. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing his Canterbury Tales in the last decades of the 14th century, right in the period our story inhabits, set his entire collection of stories in an inn. The Tabard Inn in Southwark, a real place. You can find references to it in documents dating to the actual medieval period. His choice was not accidental. The inn, the tavern, the alehouse, the common room where strangers gathered and stories were told, was the one space in medieval society where the strict hierarchies of the outside world were partially suspended. Not eliminated. Never eliminated. You could still tell a knight from a miller by their clothing, their bearing, their accent. But for the duration of an evening in the warmth of a common room with ale in hand, a knight and a miller could sit at adjacent tables and hear the same story. That is remarkable, actually. For a world as rigidly stratified as 14th century England, where your birth determined almost everything about your life, where you owed service to a lord and tithes to a church, and you could be fined for wearing the wrong fabric, the alehouse was the one space that belonged in some fundamental sense to everyone who walked through the door. Marjorie charged everyone the same price. She was required to by law. The fire is bright in here tonight. The bone dice click on the leather square. Someone at the long table is telling a story about a horse that got loose at the fair last Tuesday, and the telling is getting longer and more elaborate with every cup. The travelling peddler in the corner has heard 3 pieces of information tonight that will be in 2 different towns by the end of the week, and Marjorie, who has been on her feet since before sunrise, who brewed this morning's batch before the church bells rang. Prime, who has not sat down since noon, is wiping down the counter with the particular efficiency of a person who has done this exact motion 10,000 times. She knows when the last customer will leave. She knows what time she needs to be up tomorrow. She knows exactly what is in every cup and how much it cost. And she knows in that particular way that people who run the room always know almost everything of consequence that has happened in this town today. The alehouse will empty soon. One by one the men will pull on their cloaks and feel the shock of the cold night air after the warmth inside. They will navigate the dark lanes to their homes, some of them singing very quietly, trying not to disturb the watchman who may or may not be genuinely awake in his corner. Marjorie will bank the fire. She will count what is in the box. She will make a mental note of what she needs to brew tomorrow and whether she needs more barley. And then she will do what every person in this town has been doing all evening, in their own way, in their own order. She will eat something. Not the roasted meats of popular imagination, not the gleaming banquet table of the Hollywood medieval feast. Something much simpler, something that most of us have completely wrong. And what that something actually was and why everything you think you know about medieval food is probably at least half incorrect is exactly what we need to talk about next. Right. Let's settle something once and for all. Because I have to be honest with you about something that has bothered me every single time I watch a historical drama set in the Middle Ages. Every feast scene, every candlelit banquet, every table groaning under the weight of roasted meats and golden goblets. It's all, and I say this with full respect to every prop designer and set decorator who worked very hard, mostly nonsense. Not the candles. The candles are accurate. Good job on the candles. But the food. The food is where most of us has been quietly, cheerfully misled for decades. Tonight, let's actually sit down at a medieval table and eat what was really there. The first thing you need to understand is this. For the vast majority of people living in a 14th century town, the evening meal was not the main event of the day. It was the afterthought. Supper, the evening meal was smaller, simpler, and quieter than the midday meal, which was called dinner, and which happened around 10 or 11 in the morning for wealthier households and midday for working people. The whole architecture of medieval eating was built around the sun. You ate your largest meal when you had the most light and energy to digest it. You ate a lighter supper before the darkness made everything more difficult. So when our townspeople arrive home after the curfew, bell-tired, smoke-smelling feet aching, what they sit down to is not a feast. It is a continuation. A winding down, the last small kindness of the day, and for most of them that last kindness looks like this. A clay pot sitting near the hearth, or where the hearth used to be now carefully covered under its terracotta dome, filled with a thick, dark, dense, wonderfully fragrant stew. The medieval world had a word for it, pottage, and pottage is, I think, one of the most underappreciated foods in human history. Think of it this way. Imagine a soup that never fully ends, a pot that sits near the fire for days, sometimes weeks, into which you add whatever is available, leeks from the garden, a handful of dried peas, some scraps of salted pork, fat, a fistful of oats, cabbage leaves that are getting soft herbs from the window box. Some is eaten each day. New things are added each day. The result is a dish that is genuinely impossible to make exactly the same twice. It is alive in a sense, constantly shifting. Every bowl drawn from it carries the accumulated flavour of everything that came before. Researchers at the University of Bristol analysed food residues from cooking pots discovered at the small medieval village of West Cotton in Northamptonshire. Pots that had been sitting in the ground for 7 centuries. By identifying the lipid traces still present in the porous ceramic walls, they found that mutton and beef pottage with cabbage and leek was exactly what the evidence showed. Not the bland, grey, flavourless gruel of popular imagination. Actual stew. Recognisable, nourishing, and with the herbs from a peasant's garden plot genuinely flavourful. The medieval peasant was not eating badly. She was eating wisely within the constraints of what the season and the land provided. Now let me address the misconception that I personally find most amusing. Here it is when people imagine medieval food, they imagine vast quantities of roasted meat, whole animals turning on spits, legs of mutton, haunches of venison, pigs done to a crackle, and yes, that existed. But for a much, much smaller portion of the population than most people assume. Grain provided somewhere between 65 and 70% of all calories consumed by average people in early 14th century Europe. 65 to 70%. That means bread, porridge, gruel, and pottage were not the accompaniment to the meal. They were the meal. Everything else, the meat, the fish, the cheese, the occasional egg, was the accompaniment. We have it exactly backwards in our imagination. And one more thing that always delights me to mention: there were no tomatoes, no potatoes, no chili peppers, no chocolate. All of those came from the Americas, and Europeans would not encounter them until after the year 1492. So every time you see a medieval feast in a film with a rich red tomato-based sauce on the table, there it is, the anachronism. The medieval cook had never seen a tomato. She probably would have been deeply suspicious of it. Let's talk about bread for a moment, because bread in the medieval world was not a simple thing. It was a statement. What kind of bread you ate told everyone at the table instantly, without a word, exactly who you were and where you stood. The nobility ate white bread made from finely milled wheat flour, soft, light, delicate, called manchet in England. The kind of bread you bake when you want to demonstrate that you have enough wheat to waste on the expensive milling process. Working people and tradespeople ate a darker bread made from rye or from a mixture of rye and wheat called maslin. Dense, heavy, chewy, genuine bread. The kind that actually keeps you upright through a 14-hour working day. And in hard years after a poor harvest, when grain was short, people put whatever they could into the bread dough. Beans, peas, acorns, whatever was available and would bind and fill. But here is the detail I love most about medieval bread. At a formal meal in a lord's hall or even in a prosperous merchant's house, bread was not just eaten. It was the plate. The medieval world had a word for this too: trencher. A trencher was a thick, stale piece of bread, ideally 3 to 4 days old, because fresh bread was too soft and would disintegrate cut into a flat square or round, and placed in front of you like a plate. Your food was served on top of it, the juices from your meal soaked down into the bread. The bread absorbed everything, and at the end of the meal you had a choice. You could eat the trencher yourself, though it required a certain commitment given that it was days old and now thoroughly saturated. Or you could have it collected and given to the poor waiting outside the gate. There is something quietly profound about that, isn't there? The very plates of the wealthy became the food of the hungry. The system had a kind of accidental elegance built into it. And there is also a phrase that comes directly from medieval dining that you use in ordinary conversation without thinking about it. The expression upper crust, as in the upper crust of society, the elite, the privileged. At a large feast, the finest pieces of the trencher bread, the top crust and the bottom crust, the parts that stayed firmest and most dignified throughout the meal, were reserved for the highest-ranking guests. The softer, more ordinary middle sections went to those of lower standing. Upper crust, 700 years old, still in your vocabulary, still meaning exactly what it always meant. Now, something else that needs addressing: forks. You may be wondering, sitting wherever you are right now with your fork within arm's reach, why forks do not appear in this picture. The answer is that medieval Europe had a genuinely complicated relationship with the fork as an eating implement. Forks existed. Cooking forks, large service forks for carving and serving, those were known. But the small personal fork used for putting food into your own mouth, that was controversial. There's a famous case from the 11th century. A Venetian noblewoman married to a member of the Byzantine nobility was documented using a small golden fork at her meals. When she died of plague, as it happens, at least one contemporary commentator interpreted her death as divine punishment for using a fork at dinner. The argument roughly was that God had given us fingers for this purpose, and that using an artificial instrument was a kind of rejection of that gift. I want to be careful not to mock this too easily, because the same logic that makes it sound absurd also tells us something real about how deeply food and faith and the meaning of the body were intertwined in medieval thinking. But also, yes, the idea that a fork was morally suspect is one of history's more charming footnotes. By the 14th century in England, small personal forks were not standard. You brought your own knife, you used a spoon for liquids, and for everything else you used your hands, which at any formal meal had been ceremonially washed before sitting down. Washing hands before eating was serious etiquette in the medieval world, not optional. Let's talk about drink, because the drink situation is also not what most people imagine. The standard picture is ale and wine ale forever, and that is mostly right. But here is the nuance. Water was available, people drank it. The idea that medieval people never drank water because it was always contaminated is one of history's more persistent half-truths. They drank water. They also understood without the vocabulary of germ theory that water from certain sources caused illness, and that ale did not. Medieval ale had very low alcohol content by modern standards, roughly 1% or so compared to the 4 or 5% of most modern beers. It was essentially a thin, slightly fermented grain drink. Nutritious, filling, safe, and drunk at every meal by people of every class, including children. Wine, by contrast, was the beverage of status. In England and the northern parts of Europe, where grapes did not grow, wine was imported primarily from Bordeaux in France, and its presence on your table told everyone something important about your income. There is a phrase that comes from this too: to sit below the salt. At a formal medieval table, a large salt cellar, an elaborate, expensive object sat at the centre. Those of higher rank sat above it, closer to the host. Those of a lower rank sat below it, further away. Salt was expensive enough to be a status marker. Control of a salt cellar said something about who you were. Below the salt, still in use, still meaning the same thing. The church, I should mention, had an enormous influence on what medieval people ate and when they ate it. Meat was forbidden on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays as a form of religious fasting. Add to that the full 40 days of Lent and several other prescribed fast days throughout the year, and the result is that for roughly a third of every year, the question of what to eat for supper had a predetermined answer: fish or nothing. Fish was accordingly consumed in enormous quantities. Herring, cod, eel, fresh river fish were available, preserved by salting, smoking, or drying when it needed to travel any distance. And this led to one of my favourite creative workarounds in all of medieval history. Monks, specifically Benedictine. Monks who were required to observe fasting rules had a problem. Baby rabbits were a delicacy, but meat was forbidden on fast days, so at some point someone in the church, someone we should note who was both extremely devout and extremely hungry, made a ruling that newborn rabbits counted as fish, not metaphorically, not symbolically. For the purposes of fasting law, a baby rabbit was a fish. This ruling held. Monasteries across Europe raised rabbits specifically for this purpose, entirely straight-faced, theologically defensible. I have enormous respect for whoever wrote that ruling. It required a particular combination of piety, creativity, and audacity that I find genuinely inspiring. And what about the merchants, the craftspeople, the people somewhere between the peasant family eating their pottage and the lord's household with its trenchers and imported wine? This is the interesting middle. A prosperous wool merchant in our 14th century town might come home to a supper of good dark bread. A portion of cheese, and medieval cheese was not so different from what you might find today. Varieties resembling brie from northern France, Edam from the Low Countries, and early Parmesan from Italy were already established. Perhaps some salted fish, a preserved vegetable, and a decent quality ale. Not glamorous by any standard, but solid, nourishing, shared around a table with family and perhaps a servant or apprentice, who ate alongside them because in medieval households the table was not stratified by generation or employment. You sat together, you passed things, you talked. The food was modest, but the act of eating was communal in a way that many modern households, with their separate schedules and separate rooms and separate screens, have quietly lost. I want to share one more thing before we leave the table. A monk at Westminster Abbey in the late 15th century was entitled on a standard day to 2¼ pounds of bread, 5 eggs, 2 pounds of meat on meat-eating days, and 2 pounds of fish on fish days, every single day. That is an extraordinary amount of food, and researchers have estimated that a working peasant in the 14th century needed roughly 4,000 calories each day just to sustain the physical labour that kept them alive hauling, digging, building, harvesting. 4,000 calories. The food was humble, but there was a lot of it, and the people who grew it, prepared it and ate it were not frail, starving figures from a dark age. They were human beings who had figured out across centuries of trial and necessity how to keep themselves fed and working and alive from one difficult year to the next. That is not nothing. That is in its own way extraordinary. The supper bowls are empty now, the bread has been eaten or set aside, the ale is nearly gone, and in this house, in this town, in this 14th century evening that is now fully, completely dark, someone needs to know where you have been, what you were doing, and whether you had any business being out after the curfew bell. Because out there in the lanes that connect this house to every other house in town, a man with a lantern is walking, and he has been walking all night, and he is watching. Picture this. You're a man named Thomas, a tanner by trade, hands that smell permanently of oak bark and animal hide no matter how long you scrub them. You live on a narrow lane called appropriately Tanner's Row, in a town of roughly 4,000 souls somewhere in central England. And tonight, Thomas, it is your turn. Not your turn to work, not your turn to cook or pray or sit by whatever warmth is left in the fire. Tonight it is your turn to walk the dark streets of this town until the sun comes up armed with a lantern, a long stick and whatever personal authority you can project through the sheer blankness of the night air. Tonight, Thomas, you are the night watch, and God help this town. The medieval night watch is one of those subjects that historians approach with a kind of fond exasperation. Because the institution was on paper essential. It was the thin line between order and chaos in a world without police, without forensic investigation, without anything resembling the law enforcement systems we take completely for granted today. And in practice, in the actual lived, muddy, ale-scented reality of a 14th century town, it was frequently a bit of a disaster. But let's start at the beginning, because the disaster has a very official origin. In the year 1285, King Edward I of England signed into law a document called the Statute of Winchester. It is one of those legal documents that does not get nearly enough attention given what it actually contains, because buried inside this statute is essentially the blueprint for community law enforcement in England that would remain in effect mostly unchanged for the next 540 years, until the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829 finally replaced it. 540 years. That is roughly the same span of time as between now and the year 1485. The Statute of Winchester had several provisions, but for our purposes tonight the critical one is this, and I am paraphrasing the original text slightly but not by much. From the day of Ascension unto the day of St. Michael in every city by 6 men at every gate, in every borough by 12 men, in every town by 6 or 4 according to the number of the inhabitants. They shall keep watch continually all night from sun setting unto sun rising. 6 men per gate, 12 in a borough, 6 or 4 in smaller towns. And here is the crucial line that follows. If any stranger do pass by them, he shall be arrested until morning, not questioned, not warned, arrested until morning. If you were a stranger walking through a medieval town after dark, the law said you were to be detained. Full stop. You could explain yourself in the morning in the light when someone could look at your face. But tonight, suspicion was enough. Now let me ask you something. If you imagine yourself as a medieval townsperson going about your ordinary business, and you're suddenly told that every few weeks you're legally required to spend an entire night walking the dark streets as a watchman, how enthusiastic would you be? If your answer is not very, you're in excellent company. Because the watch and ward system was built on something remarkable, compulsory, unpaid rotating civic duty. Every able-bodied man in the town was placed on a roster by the constable, the town's chief law enforcement officer, who was himself an unpaid civic appointment, and each man was called up for night watch duty on a rotating basis. No salary, no choice, no excuse accepted without consequence. And as you might expect with a system built on compulsory unpaid labour, the quality was not always what the king might have hoped for. Here is a detail that I genuinely love. By the later medieval period, wealthy townspeople had discovered a workaround. If your name came up on the watch roster, and you did not feel like spending a winter night in the dark holding a stick, you could simply hire someone to go in your place. A professional deputy, a stand-in, someone who would take your turn of the watch for a small payment. And so, over time, a semi-professional class of night watchmen emerged, men who made at least part of their living by absorbing other people's watch duties. Which sounds like a reasonable solution, until you consider who these men tended to be. They were not in general young and vigorous. They were not keen and alert. One critic of the system, writing in the early 19th century, but describing a tradition that had barely changed since the Middle Ages, advertised satirically for watchmen in what he called the ideal qualifications for the role, aged 60, 70, 80 or 90. Blind in one eye and seeing very little with the other, crippled in one or both legs, deaf as a post with an asthmatical cough, moving no faster than a snail, and with the strength of arm, he added, not able to arrest an old washerwoman of 80. Now, to be fair to the medieval watchmen, and I do want to be fair because their job was genuinely difficult, the conditions they worked in were not exactly designed for success. No street lighting, none. The streets of a medieval town at night were not dimly lit. They were not romantically shadowed. They were completely, profoundly, almost physically dark. On a cloudy night without a moon, even a man with a lantern could see perhaps 10 or 15 feet ahead of him. Beyond that, nothing, armed with what the Statute of Winchester and later regulations specified: a lantern, a pole or staff, and in earlier periods sometimes a halberd. The watchmen walked their assigned lanes in pairs, calling out the hours and the state of the weather as they went, so that sleeping residents could hear them passing. Past 1 of the clock, a cold night, all is well. Past 3 of the clock, cloudy, all is well. This calling out of the hours had a name. The men who did it were called the waits, from an Old English word for watcher. In the later Middle Ages, some of the waits even played music as they walked, using horns and simple instruments to mark their passage through the dark, which means that on certain quiet medieval nights, you might lie in your bed and hear, floating through the darkness, the distant sound of a horn playing softly somewhere out on the lane, and you would know someone is out there. Someone is awake so that you can sleep. There is something unexpectedly beautiful about that, but here is where I want to get specific. Because the hue and cry, which is what happened when the watch encountered someone they could not simply detain, is one of the most fascinating legal concepts in medieval history. The hue and cry was ancient even by the 13th century. It predated the Statute of Winchester. It was a Saxon tradition codified into Norman law, and then formalised again by Edward I. The principle was this: if a crime was committed, a robbery, an assault, something serious, and the watchman or any citizen witnessed it or discovered it, they were legally obligated to raise the cry. Not ask for help, not report it to an authority. Raise the cry, meaning shout, loudly, immediately, at the top of your lungs. And upon hearing that shout, every able-bodied man in earshot was legally required to stop what he was doing and join the pursuit. Not encouraged, required. Failure to respond to the hue and cry was itself a criminal offence, and it did not stop at the town limits. The statute specified that the cry was to be taken from town to town and from county to county until the felon is apprehended and delivered to the sheriff. A wave of shouting men spreading outward from the point of the crime, crossing the countryside, passing through village after village. And here is the truly remarkable part. If the criminal escaped, if the hue and cry was raised and the community failed to catch the offender, the Statute of Winchester specified that the whole 100 shall be answerable, the whole district, collectively responsible, collectively fined. This was not a small threat. 100 was an administrative area containing multiple villages and thousands of people. A collective fine meant everyone paid, everyone suffered, which created a very interesting incentive structure. If a crime was committed near your village and you did not respond to the hue and cry, you were not just being unhelpful, you were potentially costing your neighbours money. Medieval law enforcement was at its core a community liability system. You protected each other, or you paid for each other's failures. Think about how different that is from modern life. Today, if you hear a disturbance outside your window, the expected response is to call the appropriate service and wait. Going outside to physically chase someone is in most contexts considered inadvisable, perhaps even legally complicated. In 1300 and 14th century England, staying inside was the legally complicated option. I do not say this to romanticize it. Medieval justice could be brutal and arbitrary, and a mob responding to a hue and cry was not always a precise instrument. Innocent people were caught up in these pursuits. Wrong identifications were made. Communities settled old scores under the cover of legitimate enforcement. But the underlying idea that safety is a collective obligation, not someone else's responsibility, is something that I find genuinely worth sitting with. Now back to our watchman Thomas. The practical reality of his night, if we follow it honestly, looks something like this. He begins his patrol around 9 o'clock after the last of the legitimate stragglers have cleared the streets. He walks his assigned route, perhaps 3 or 4 lanes, with his lantern and his pole. He calls the hours. He checks the gates to ensure they are properly barred. Around midnight he is cold. His feet hurt. He has not encountered anything more threatening than a cat. There is a warm light visible under the door of a victualler's house, a sort of informal late-night eating and drinking establishment. Historical records from a later period actually document a group of watchmen who were discovered to have spent an entire night inside exactly such a place, drinking and taking tobacco all night long, as the source puts it. Whether Thomas joins them or passes by is a question of personal character. Let us be generous and say he passes by. He continues his route. At some point in the small hours he encounters someone moving in the dark, a figure no lantern moving quickly along the lane. He is required by law to challenge them. Think of the phrase you have almost certainly heard in some historical context or another hark who goes there. That phrase is not a dramatic invention. It is a functional summary of the medieval watchman's legal duty. Challenge the stranger. Demand identification. If they cannot satisfactorily explain their presence, detain them until morning. If they run, raise the cry. Who actually got stopped? This is where medieval class reality intersect with medieval law in an illuminating way. The Statute of Winchester was in theory universal. A stranger found on the street after dark was a stranger regardless of their station. In practice, a recognizable wealthy merchant, a minor noble, anyone with obvious social status, these people pass through with minimal interference. The records from later periods show a lord's servant actually becoming indignant when stopped by the watch, insisting it was a disgrace to detain someone of such standing. The watchman largely agreed with him. He was allowed to continue. Those detained overnight until morning, held in what was sometimes literally a cage set in the street called a tun, were overwhelmingly strangers, travellers without local connections, the poor, the unknown. This is not a comfortable observation, but it is an honest one. Medieval law enforcement, like most law enforcement throughout history, was applied with significant unevenness. The watch protected the town, but exactly whom it protected most, and from whom it was most alert, that depended on things that had nothing to do with the law. And the corruption. Oh, the corruption. Records document watchmen who accepted bribes to look the other way. Watchmen who extorted small payments from people caught out after dark in exchange for not arresting them. Watchman Edward Gardner. A real documented case was found to have accepted 2 shillings to allow a woman to escape, rather than escorting her to the authorities as required. 2 shillings. Medieval corruption operated on a remarkably accessible scale. But here is the thing I keep coming back to when I think about the night watch in its full complicated reality. These men, Thomas the Tanner, whoever else was on the roster this week, the tired and the cold and the occasionally bribed, were the only thing standing between a sleeping town and whatever the darkness might bring. There was no one else, no headquarters to call, no rapid response, no reinforcement on standby, just a man with a lantern and a stick walking in the dark, calling the hours so that everyone else could sleep without worrying too much about what was moving in the lanes outside. And for all their very real failures, and they were real, they kept at it. Night after night, from the day of Ascension to the day of St. Michael, from sun setting to sun rising. Because someone had to. The hours are now past midnight. Thomas is somewhere on his 4th pass through Tanner's Row lantern, swinging breath steaming in the cold air. The town is quiet. The fires are covered. The gates are shut. Most of the 4,000 souls in this place are asleep. And those who are not asleep, who are moving through the town on some errand of the night, for reasons legitimate or otherwise, move differently than they would in daylight. They move carefully. They listen for footsteps, because navigating this town after dark is not simply a matter of knowing where you're going. It is a skill, an art, one that most of us have completely lost. And what it required, the lamps, the sounds, the tricks of memory and nose and ear that medieval people used to move through total darkness, is a story that takes us somewhere quieter, somewhere that actually requires you to slow down and pay attention, right along this very next lane. So now you know who Thomas is, the tanner, the night watchman, the man with the lantern and the stick walking his route on Tanner's Row as midnight comes and goes. He's out there right now in the dark doing his civic duty with varying degrees of enthusiasm. But what about everyone else? What about the people who have genuine business after dark? The midwife called across town to a difficult birth, the merchant who stayed too late at the alehouse and has to find his way home, the journeyman who fell asleep at a friend's house and now needs to navigate 3 unfamiliar lanes in absolute darkness. How did they actually do it? Because here is the thing that most people never stop to ask. There were no street signs, there were no house numbers, there were no maps that ordinary people owned or could read, and there was in most parts of this town on most nights essentially no light at all. Let me make the darkness real for you. Not the comfortable, slightly dim darkness of a power cut where your phone still glows and the street outside still carries ambient light from distant windows and passing cars. I mean the darkness of a moonless winter night in a medieval town away from the 1 or 2 windows still glowing with permitted firelight. The kind of dark where you genuinely cannot see your own hand held at arm's length. Historians studying medieval life have noted repeatedly that modern people have almost no frame of reference for this. We live in a world saturated with ambient light from screens, from street lamps, from the orange glow that sits permanently above every inhabited place on Earth. Even in what we call darkness, there is usually enough photon pollution that our eyes can adjust, make shapes, find edges. Medieval night in a lane between high timber-framed buildings away from any window under cloud cover was genuinely completely physically opaque. You were not navigating in dim light. You were navigating without it. So what did you do? The first option was the obvious one: you carried light. And the most common form of portable light in 14th century England was not the dramatic swooping torch of the movies. Torches, bundles of pitch-soaked wood were used certainly, but they burned for roughly 45 minutes. They produced enormous quantities of acrid smoke. They were expensive in fuel and labour, and they posed a significant fire risk to every thatched and timber surface they passed near. What most people actually carried was a lantern with a tallow candle inside. The lantern itself was typically a wooden or metal frame fitted with thin panels of animal horn. Horn could be shaved to translucency, allowing light through without glass, which was expensive and fragile. The horn panels protected the candle flame from wind, which was the single biggest enemy of anyone trying to stay lit in medieval conditions. A tallow candle in a good horn lantern could illuminate roughly a circle of perhaps 3 or 4 feet in reliable visibility. Beyond that, the edges of your light became unreliable, and beyond 8 feet or so you were back in darkness. 3 to 4 feet. That is the radius of safety in which you existed moving through the medieval night. Everything outside that circle was guesswork. But here is what I find genuinely fascinating. Most people, most of the time, did not actually carry a lantern. Because a lantern, even a simple wooden one, cost money. The candle inside cost money. The tallow to make the candle cost money. For a household operating on a margin of subsistence, the idea of burning light simply to walk home from the alehouse was a luxury that had to be weighed against other needs. So for most ordinary people, most of the time, the solution to navigating medieval darkness was something far more ancient and far more interesting. Memory. Think about this for a moment. You have lived in this town your whole life. You were born in a house on this lane. You learned to walk on these cobblestones. You have walked from your house to the church, from your house to the market, from your house to the well, from your house to the alehouse, and back again thousands of times. You know this town the way you know the inside of your own hand. You know that the cobblestones on the corner near the baker's are slightly raised on the left side. You have stumbled there before. You know that the lane narrows just past the tanner's yard, and you need to angle your shoulder slightly, or you catch the beam. You know that the third house from the corner has a low gutter that channels rainwater across the path, and if it has rained recently, that exact spot will be slick. You know all of this not because you have thought about it, but because your body has learned it. Medieval people navigating at night were not lost. They were operating on a kind of physical knowledge that we in our well-lit GPS-guided, signposted world have almost completely outsourced to external systems. Their map was internal, and for locals in their own familiar territory it worked remarkably well. But what about strangers? What about a traveller arriving in an unfamiliar town, or a craftsman newly arrived from the countryside to seek work, or anyone who needed to find a specific address in a place they did not know well? This is where medieval street names become genuinely one of my favourite topics in all of history. Because medieval street names were not decorative, they were functional descriptions, they were directions. If you needed to find the street where blacksmiths worked, you looked for a lane called Smithfield, or Ironmonger Lane or Forge Street. If you needed a butcher, you went to the shambles, a word that originally meant the benches or stalls where meat was sold, and which is still used in York today, one of the best preserved medieval street layouts in England. If you wanted bread, you went to Bread Street. If you needed fish, you went to Fish Street Hill, where the market had always been close to the river. If you wanted honey, you went to Honey Lane, Milk Street, Poultry. These are not coincidences or quaint survivals. They are evidence of an entire system of urban navigation built on the assumption that what a street contained defined what a street was called. You did not need to know the address. You needed to know what you were looking for. Then you asked for the street named after it and you went there. The smell helped too, significantly. In a world without refrigeration, without sewage systems in our modern sense, and without the artificial deodorizing that we apply to every surface of our lives, a medieval town at night was navigable in part by nose. The tanneries had a smell that carried for blocks sharp animal, faintly nauseating if you were not used to it, absolutely unmistakable. The butcher's district had its smell, particularly in summer, concentrated around the lane that contemporary sources described as smelling of what medieval people euphemistically called pudding, which is to say, the entrails and offal of slaughtered animals. That lane in London was actually named Pudding Lane, the same Pudding Lane where a baker's fire started in 1666 and burned down most of the city. The historian John Stowe, writing in the late 16th century, described Pudding Lane without embarrassment as the lane where butchers from the Eastcheap Market had their scalding house for hogs, and where puddings with other filth of beasts are voided down that way to their dung boats on the Thames. A dung boat on the Thames, collecting the entrails from Pudding Lane. This is the street that gave its name to the most famous fire in English history. The bread and pastry association of the name came much later and was entirely accidental. The bread, the fish, the tanneries, the stables. Each quarter of a medieval town had its own particular atmosphere of smell, and someone moving through the dark with a functioning nose and a good memory could navigate by this as much as by any visual landmark. Sound mattered too. Water was navigational landmark. If you could hear the sound of a conduit, one of the stone public water fountains that larger medieval towns maintained at key intersections, you knew where you were relative to the market square. If you could hear the bell of the night watch calling the hour from his position on a known route, you could orient yourself by how far away it sounded and from which direction it came. In the deepest silence of 3 a.m, when the watch had passed and the bells had been quiet for an hour, the town still had sounds. Wind moving through the narrow lanes from a predictable direction. The creak of a specific iron bracket on a specific building. The distinctive way sound bounced differently when you were approaching a wider space like the market square, versus when you were hemmed in on both sides by tall timber buildings. Your ears were doing as much work as your eyes. And here is the question I want to ask you now, because I am genuinely curious what your answer is. Do you know your immediate neighbourhood well enough to navigate it in total darkness, not with a phone, not with memory of a map, just with your body, your ears, your nose, and whatever physical knowledge you have accumulated in the time you've lived there? For most of us, I suspect the honest answer is probably not very far. We've handed navigation so completely to external systems, to lit streets, to street signs, to GPS, that the internal map most of us carry is remarkably shallow. Medieval people had no choice but to carry a deep one. They memorized their world the way we now let technology memorize it for us. There is a detail I want to share before we leave the subject of medieval lighting, because it reframes something you almost certainly think you already know. The word candle is so ordinary to us now that we barely register it. But in the 14th century, the type of candle you burned at night was a remarkably precise social signal. At the bottom were rushlight, the simplest possible form of home illumination, A strip of dried rush pith soaked in animal fat burned in a simple iron holder. It produced a faint, somewhat smoky flame. It cost almost nothing to make. It was the light of the very poor. Above that, the tallow candle made from rendered animal fat shaped by repeated dipping of a wick. It burned brighter than a rushlight, lasted longer, but produced a noticeable smell, the smell of rendered fat and a fair amount of sooty smoke. At the top, the beeswax candle. Beeswax candles burned cleanly with almost no smoke, with a warm bright light, and with a faintly pleasant smell compared to the fatty odour of tallow. They are also dramatically more expensive. The Wax Chandlers' Company Guild in London, established by royal decree in 1358, had a monopoly on the sale of beeswax candles within the city. Beeswax was imported from as far as Russia and Hungary to meet demand. Beeswax candles were the light of wealthy homes, the church, and the nobility. In fact, beeswax candles were the only form of light officially permitted in a medieval church, which means that if you walked past a building at night and saw a clean, bright, steady flame with no flicker of smoking tallow, you were almost certainly looking at either a wealthy household or a house of God. Thomas the tanner walking his route with a lantern tallow. The merchant who left the alehouse slightly later than he intended, possibly a small rushlight tucked into a clay holder in his pocket. The wealthy widow on the lane near the market whose household could afford better, perhaps the one beeswax candle she was keeping lit tonight for reasons her own. The type of flame told you the story of the house before you knocked on the door. By the time we reached the late 14th century, the larger towns of England were beginning to grapple unevenly, expensively, without much success, with the question of whether there ought to be any public lighting at all. Some towns issued ordinances requiring householders to hang a lantern outside their door after dark. Some guild districts maintained a lamp or a torch bracket at a key intersection, funded by communal contribution. But systematic organised street lighting, the kind that Paris would eventually install in the 17th century, when 2,700 oil lanterns were hung on cables across the city's main streets, was still centuries away from our 14th century town. In Paris in 1694, an official eventually received a licence to hang an oil lamp in front of every 10th house lit from 6 in the evening to midnight, between the autumn and spring equinoxes. That was 1694, more than 300 years after our evening, and so late on this particular night in our particular town the darkness remains as it has always been, absolute, generous, and entirely democratic. It does not matter if you are the wealthiest merchant in the market square or the newest apprentice arrived this week from the countryside. Once you step out of the radius of your lantern, the dark is the same for everyone. The difference is only in how well you know the ground beneath your feet, how deeply your body has learned the town, how far your internal map extends. The lanes are almost entirely empty now. Thomas the tanner has made his last patrol and retreated to a marginally warmer corner somewhere near the gate. The alehouse door finally went dark an hour ago. The market square is deserted, the cobblestones silver in the thin light of a quarter moon just beginning to show through the clouds, and at the far end of the quietest lane in this quarter of town, on a street that smells of dried herbs and something resinous and clean, there is still one candle burning, not tallow. The flame is steady, bright, almost no smoke, and behind it someone is still working. Somewhere off the main lane, past the tanner's row and the baker's cold ovens, there is a window where a single candle still burns. It has been burning all evening. It will likely burn until well past midnight, and the person sitting behind that light measuring, grinding, straining labelling with a careful hand is the one person in this town who is legally, professionally, and by the nature of their work permitted to keep that candle lit after curfew. The apothecary never really closes. Before we go inside, I want to ask you something. When you think of medieval medicine, the herbs, the remedies, the healing practices of 700 years ago, What image comes to mind, be honest? Probably something between primitive and dangerous, leeches and superstition, bloodletting and prayer, people dying of things we could cure in a weekend. And that image is not entirely wrong. Medieval medicine had very real limitations, some of them fatal. There were theories that caused more harm than good practices that we now know to have been actively counterproductive, and moments of breathtaking ignorance dressed in the language of scholarship. But here is what that image almost always leaves out. It also contained, scattered quietly through the herbs and the recipes and the handwritten manuscripts, an astonishing amount of knowledge that was simply correct. Knowledge that worked. Knowledge that is still working today in your medicine cabinet under different names. And one of the most remarkable scientific discoveries of the 21st century, and I mean that genuinely not as dramatic storytelling began, with a researcher in a university laboratory picking up a 1,000-year-old medical text and deciding almost on a whim to actually test what it said. That story is where we are going tonight. First, let me introduce you to the apothecary. In a town of the 14th century, the apothecary occupied a strange and fascinating position. Not a physician, not a surgeon, not a priest. The physician who had trained at one of the great medical schools at Salerno in southern Italy or Montpellier in France was a figure of high learning who mostly served the wealthy. He diagnosed, he theorized. He rarely touched the patient with his own hands because touching was considered below his station. The surgeon, often also a barber, hence the long-standing title of barber surgeon, actually cut things, set bones, removed teeth, dealt with the messy physical reality of bodies that needed mechanical intervention. But the apothecary was something else. The apothecary was in the most practical sense the neighbourhood pharmacist, herbalist, chemist and health consultant all folded into one. They prepared and dispensed remedies. They maintained stocks of dried herbs, roots, resins, imported spices and animal products with medicinal uses. They understood dosages, preparation methods, the difference between a tincture and a decoction, between a poultice and a compress. And in the larger towns of medieval Europe by the late 13th and early 14th centuries, they had their own guild. In England and across much of Europe, apothecaries and artists shared a guild, the Guild of St. Luke. Take a moment with that. Apothecaries and painters united in the same professional organization. The reason is entirely practical. Both trades relied on the same raw materials. The pigments used to make paint and the compounds used in medicines often came from the same sources. Ground minerals, plant extracts, substances imported from the Arab world via Italian trading houses at enormous expense. The same substance that produced a rich lapis blue on a painted altarpiece might in a different preparation treat an inflammation of the eye. Medieval life contained these overlaps constantly in ways that still catch me off guard. Now, what was actually in this room? Let me paint the picture because the medieval apothecary shop is genuinely one of the most sensory-rich environments imaginable. Dried bundles of herbs hanging from the ceiling, rosemary, thyme, lavender, fennel, sage, wormwood, yarrow. The smell of them filling every corner, overlapping and layering so densely that you would carry the scent in your clothes for days after a single visit. Rows of ceramic jars on wooden shelves, each carefully labelled, roots ground to powder, leaves dried and pressed, resins brought from distant places, frankincense, myrrh, galangal, a mortar and pestle that had been in use so long its stone was smooth and stained with decades of grinding, and in the corner a small brazier or lamp for heating preparations, the kind of controlled purposeful heat that was entirely different from the dangerous open fire that everyone else in town had just carefully covered for the night. The apothecary's candle was not decorative, it was a tool. Here is where I need to address the four humours, because you cannot talk about medieval medicine honestly without them. The governing medical theory of the medieval world, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, and filtered through centuries of Arab and European scholarship held that the human body was governed by 4 substances called humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health meant these 4 were in balance. Illness meant one had become excessive or deficient. Every treatment, every herb, every remedy was understood through this framework. A hot and dry herb like rosemary would counteract a cold and wet excess of phlegm. A cooling remedy like cucumber would reduce the heat of a fever caused by excess yellow bile. This system was wrong in the way that any complete theory of something deeply complex can be wrong, not in every detail but in its fundamental explanatory framework. There are no humours. The body does not work this way. But here is the thing that I find genuinely interesting about the humoral system. It was a rational framework constructed from careful observation, internally consistent and capable of generating predictions. And because the medieval apothecary was working within this framework, systematically, thoughtfully testing and recording outcomes across generations, some of what they arrived at was correct by accident, or rather correct because plants contain real chemistry, and careful observation eventually identifies what works regardless of whether the theory explaining it is accurate. The theory was wrong. The plant still had the same molecules in it. Let me give you the most important example: willow bark. In the medieval world, a preparation made from the bark of the white willow tree was used regularly for the relief of pain, fever, and inflammation. The theory held that willow was cool and dry, and therefore counteracted the heat of fever. The theory was incorrect, but the treatment worked because white willow bark contains a compound called salicin, which the human body metabolizes into salicylic acid, the same active mechanism as aspirin. The willow tree has been containing salicin for millions of years. Medieval healers documented its use for pain and fever because they had observed across generations of practice that it consistently helped. They had the right answer. They had the wrong explanation. Modern aspirin, one of the most widely consumed pharmaceutical compounds in human history, with an estimated 40,000 metric tons taken globally every year, is a synthetic refinement of a compound that a medieval apothecary in our 14th century town was preparing in their workshop tonight. Does that sit differently when you think about it that way? And then there is the story I mentioned earlier, the one that begins with a researcher picking up an old book. In the year 2015, a team of researchers at the University of Nottingham and later the University of Warwick decided to do something unusual. They found a text called Bald's Leech Book, an Old English medical manuscript from approximately the 9th century, one of the oldest surviving medical texts in English, and they decided to actually make one of its recipes. The recipe was for an eye salve, a treatment for what the text called a wen, on the eye, likely an infection of the eyelid or the surface of the eye. The ingredients were equal parts garlic and onion or leek wine and ox bile. These were to be mixed steeped in a brass vessel for 9 days, strained through a cloth, and then applied. The researchers, who were microbiologists, not medievalists, were initially skeptical. This sounded like exactly the kind of thing that would prove nothing. What happened when they tested it against modern bacterial infections, including strains of a bacterium called Staphylococcus aureus, including the antibiotic-resistant form known as MRSA, was not what anyone expected. The preparation killed approximately 90% of bacterial cells, 90%, against MRSA. When researchers tested each ingredient individually, none of them produced significant results on their own. It was the combination, the specific interaction chemistry, that developed during the 9-day brewing process, the trace copper ions introduced by the brass vessel, the acid environment of the wine altering the bioavailability of the sulfur compounds that created the active agent. A recipe over 1,000 years old, recorded in a manuscript that most people would have dismissed as medieval folklore, contained a functional antibiotic combination that modern science had not yet identified. This is not the exception in medieval herbal medicine, it is a pattern: honey. The medieval apothecary used honey in wound dressings, burns and infected skin conditions constantly. It was one of the most universally recommended preparations across medieval European medical texts. Today specifically a variety called Manuka honey from New Zealand. Honey-based wound dressings are used in modern clinical settings for exactly the same purpose, because honey creates an acidic, osmotically hostile environment that bacteria cannot survive in, and because certain varieties contain a compound called methyl glyoxal with specific antimicrobial action. Medieval healers did not know any of this chemistry. They knew that wounds covered in honey healed better than wounds left open, which is at the end of the day the most important thing to know. Garlic. The Roman soldiers who marched across Europe carried it in their packs. Medieval plague doctors stuffed it into the beak-shaped masks that became their terrifying symbol. The apothecary in our town would have had garlic in multiple preparations. Modern science has confirmed that garlic contains a compound called allicin, formed when the clove is crushed with documented antimicrobial and cardiovascular properties. The medieval healer was not wrong to reach for garlic. They were working from centuries of accumulated empirical observation packaged inside a theoretical framework that explained the results incorrectly, but pointed toward treatments that were genuinely effective. Now, I want to be fair here because intellectual honesty requires it. Not everything in medieval medicine worked, not even close. Bloodletting, the practice of removing blood from the body to correct an excess of the blood humour, was practiced so widely and with such conviction that it almost certainly caused harm, in many cases weakening patients who were already struggling and removing the very resources the body needed to fight illness. Urine examination was the primary diagnostic tool of learned physicians, inspecting the colour, smell, and consistency of a patient's urine, and using this to determine which humour was out of balance. Some of what they observed was genuinely diagnostic. Much of what they concluded from it was not, and the reliance on astrology consulting star charts to determine the optimal time for a given treatment, or to identify which part of the body was most vulnerable, based on the month, introduced a level of scheduling unpredictability that must have been frustrating for patients who simply wanted help now. Then again, the physicians who used these methods were in many cases the learned elite. The apothecary down the lane, the wise woman in the village, the herbalist who'd been treating their neighbours for 30 years with the same recipes their grandmother used. These people often operated more empirically. Less theory, more observation. What works? Do that. Hildegard of Bingen. I cannot talk about medieval medicine without mentioning her even briefly, because she's one of the most remarkable figures in this entire history, and she's still not nearly famous enough. A Benedictine abbess in 12th century Germany, she wrote 2 major medical texts, Physica and Causae et Curae, which documented her understanding of natural medicines, the human body, and the treatment of illness. She described over 200 medicinal plants. She wrote about the connections between mind and body in ways that feel startlingly modern. She advocated for attention to the patient's diet, sleep, emotional state and environment as part of treatment, a holistic perspective that mainstream European medicine would not fully re-embrace until the 20th century. She worked within the humoral theory of her time. She also pushed beyond it, describing observations and making arguments that the theory alone could not generate. Hildegard of Bingen was not a woman who happened to be interested in plants. She was a scientist operating under the constraints of the 12th century, who was doing exactly what scientists do, observing, recording, testing, and pushing toward better understanding with the tools available to her. And so back to our apothecary's candle. It is late now. The town has been quiet for hours. The watchman has called 2 of the clock, or perhaps 3, and in this small room the apothecary is still working. Maybe they are preparing a remedy that someone's child will need in the morning, a child with a cough that has gone on too long, or a fever that needs managing before it becomes something worse. Maybe they are compounding something more complex following a recipe from one of the Arabic medical texts that had been translated into Latin over the past century and made its way in copied form into their possession. Maybe they are simply checking their stock-making notes, ensuring that the jars are sealed and the dried herbs are properly stored. And as I sit with that image, I find it quietly moving. This person cannot cure everything. They know things that are incorrect. They hold a theory of the body that will be overturned. But they are also sitting on top of 5,000 years of accumulated botanical knowledge, observation compressed into recipe, compressed into tradition, compressed into the herbs on these shelves. They are in the most literal sense holding medicine in their hands, and some of it, enough of it, genuinely works. There is one more candle burning in this town tonight, but it is a different kind of light. This one is not in a shop. It is not on a lane where ordinary people live. It is behind thick stone walls set high above the town on a hill. And the sound that accompanies it is not the grinding of a mortar or the careful scratch of a quill on parchment. It is something older, something that rises and falls in a rhythm that has nothing to do with daylight or commerce or the turning of seasons. It is voices singing in the dark, and the place those voices are coming from is somewhere that has been awake every night at every hour in every season for centuries before this town even existed. That sound I promised you, the one rising from behind thick stone walls set high on the hill above the town, visible even in the dark as a massive shadow that blocks out stars. Let us go there. Not inside, you cannot go inside, not at this hour, and the gate would be shut to you in any case. But stand here just outside the wall and listen, because the sound that is coming through the stone on this cold night is one of the oldest continuous sounds in the Western world. It predates this town by centuries. It will outlast it by centuries more. Monks are singing. The last prayer of the medieval monastic day was called complin. The word comes from the Latin completorium, the completion, the finishing. It was sung at nightfall after supper when the light was entirely gone and the world outside the monastery walls had surrendered to the dark. Compline was brief compared to the other offices, a short lesson, a confession of sins, 3 psalms, a hymn, a canticle, and then the final Marian antiphon, the prayer to the Virgin that sent the community to bed. The whole service lasted perhaps 20 or 30 minutes, and when the last note of Compline died away in the stone vaulting of the chapel, something extraordinary happened. Silence, not the silence of people who happen to be quiet. Legislated, absolute, rule-bound silence. The grandi silentium, the great silence, which descended on the monastery at the end of Compline and would not lift until the morning. No speaking, no unnecessary movement, no sound beyond what the world itself made. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and governing the lives of Benedictine monks for the next 800 years and beyond, was explicit about this. The night was sacred. The silence was not optional, and any monk who broke it without genuine necessity was accountable to the community. But here is what I want you to understand about Compline itself, because most people who have never experienced it cannot quite picture what it actually sounds like. Medieval monastic prayer was not silent reading. It was not muttered under the breath. It was not even the kind of subdued congregational murmur you might hear at a modern church service. It was sung. Every hour of the divine office, all 8 of them, from the night office of matins at roughly 2 in the morning, through vespers at sunset, and finally Compline at nightfall, was sung in the plainchant tradition that we now call Gregorian chant, after Pope Gregory I, who is traditionally credited with its codification, though the music itself is older. and Gregorian chant has a quality that I find very difficult to describe to someone who has only heard it at a distance. It does not sound like music in the way we usually mean the word. It sounds more like the building itself is breathing. The long, unaccompanied melodic lines sung in unison by a room full of trained voices fill stone spaces differently from any other sound. The resonance of a vaulted medieval chapel extends each note for a second or two after it is sung, so what you hear is not simply the note, but the note and its memory both existing simultaneously, layering over each other as the melody moves forward. Standing outside in the dark with cold stone between you and the source of the sound, you hear it arriving through the wall as something that is barely music at all. Something more like vibration, something more like weather. There are 8 canonical hours in the monastic day, 8 times in every 24 hours when the monks stop whatever they are doing and go to the chapel to sing. 2 o'clock in the morning matins, before sunrise lauds, sunrise prime, mid-morning terce, midday sext, mid-afternoon, none, sunset vespers, nightfall compline, 8 times, every day, every single day of a monk's life from the day he took his vows until the day he died, and in the darkness of a medieval night when our town is finally silent and most of its 4,000 residents are asleep, the monastery is not silent. It has never been silent. At 2 in the morning those voices will rise again for matins, at 4 for lauds, at dawn for prime. The monastery never fully sleeps. It keeps vigil for the world. I want to talk about what the monastery actually was in the life of a medieval town. Because the popular image pious men in habits, copying manuscripts, growing vegetables largely withdrawn from the messy world below the hill, is accurate as far as it goes. It just does not go nearly far enough. By the early 14th century, a well-established Benedictine monastery in England was not simply a house of prayer. It was simultaneously and without contradiction a library, a hospital, a school, a bank, a guest house, a pharmacy, an agricultural research station, and the principal archive for everything that had ever been written down in that part of the world. At Christ Church in Canterbury, one of the great monasteries of medieval England, a library inventory at the beginning of the 14th century recorded 698 volumes, 698 books, at a time when a single book hand-copied on prepared animal skin could take a scribe months to produce and cost more than a craftsman earned in a year. 698. The monastery library was not a collection of devotional texts. It was the accumulated intellectual inheritance of the Western world, physically present in one building, carefully catalogued and tended, and crucially accessible to scholars who travelled to consult it. The texts of Cicero, the medical writings of Galen, the philosophy of Aristotle in Latin translation, biblical commentaries stretching back centuries, chronicles of local and national history that exist nowhere else on earth. Because the monastery was the only institution that thought to write them down and keep them. Without the monasteries, we would know radically less about the medieval world. We would know radically less about the ancient world too, because many of the classical texts that survived the fall of Rome survived precisely because a monk somewhere copied them out by hand in a scriptorium and placed them on a shelf. The Venerable Bede, writing his ecclesiastical history of the English people at the monastery of Jarrow in the early 8th century, is the primary reason we know anything at all about the early history of England. One monk, one scriptorium, one discipline of sitting down and writing it all out every day until the work was done. The scriptorium. Let me tell you about the scriptorium because it is one of the most quietly extraordinary rooms in the medieval world. It was typically positioned to catch the best light oriented toward the south or east, with large windows relative to the rest of the building designed to maximize the hours during which natural light fell on a working scribe's desk. The desks were sloped better for the wrist and neck during the hours of work. Each monk had a penknife for sharpening quills and scraping away errors, the medieval equivalent of the delete key, which required considerably more physical effort. Inkwells, pumice stone for preparing the vellum surface, rulers for ruling the lines, and the rule of St. Benedict specified one more thing about the scriptorium that I find deeply human: the monks worked in silence. Not the absolute silence of the great silence, but a disciplined quiet maintained because concentration and accuracy mattered. A mistake in a medical text could harm someone. A mistake in a theological text could mislead an entire congregation. Silence was not austere self-denial in the scriptorium. It was professional necessity. The armarius, the monk responsible for both the library and the scriptorium, managed the lending and return of books, kept the catalogue, and oversaw the quality of the copying work. It was one of the most responsible positions in the monastery. He was in every practical sense the keeper of everything the community knew. Now here is something I find genuinely moving about the scriptorium at night. It was empty. After Compline, after the great silence descended, no one worked there. The quills were set down. The ink dried on the sloped desks. The manuscripts in progress sat exactly as their scribes had left them. And in that stillness the room held a particular kind of presence. All those words accumulated over generations. Classical authors who had been dead for 1,000 years. Theologians arguing with each other across centuries, the personal annotations of individual monks in the margins, a small complaint about cold fingers, a note of wonder at a particularly good passage, a prayer written sideways along the edge of a medical text. The past breathing quietly in the dark. I mentioned the monastery as hospital, and I want to stay with that for a moment because it connects directly to the apothecary's candle we left burning in the lane below. Every medieval monastery of any size had an infirmary, a ward for sick monks certainly, but also a reception point for the sick and poor of the surrounding area. The Benedictine rule, the extraordinary 6th century document that shaped the entirety of Western monasticism, contained a specific injunction about care for the sick. The care of the sick is to be placed above and before every other duty, not placed alongside other duties, above and before. The monastery infirmary was not a last resort. It was for many people in the surrounding area the best medical care they could access, better than most could afford from a physician, better equipped than any individual household. And the monastery garden, the herb garden, carefully tended, documenting and cultivating the same plants that the apothecary in the town below stocked in her shop, was the pharmaceutical supply chain for both. Some of the most important medieval medical knowledge was created and transmitted through monasteries. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century Benedictine abbess, whose medical writings we spoke of earlier, wrote from within the monastery system. The monks who tended the infirmary and the herb garden were not separate from the scholarly world of the scriptorium. They were the same people. The same mind that copied a classical text on medicine in the morning might apply its principles to a patient's fever in the afternoon. Theory and practice living in the same building. Let me tell you about matins, because matins is the prayer that separates the monastery most completely from the sleeping world outside its walls. Matins happened in the deep of the night, roughly 2 a.m. by the rule of St. Benedict, though the exact time varied by season, with the length of the night itself determining when the monks would rise. The bell for matins rang in absolute darkness, every monk in the dormitory sleeping in their habits as the rule required so they could rise immediately woke to its sound. They rose. They walked in silence through the night air of the cloister, often bitterly cold in winter, the stone paving wet with frost to the chapel, and then they sang, for perhaps an hour or more, psalms readings responsories, the entire community awake and present in the cold chapel at 2 a.m, their breath visible in the candlelight, doing the thing they had committed their lives to doing. There is a line in the Rule of St. Benedict that I keep returning to. He quotes from Psalm 118, verse 62, "At midnight I rise to praise you." That was not a metaphor. That was a schedule. Outside the monastery walls in our town, almost everyone is asleep. Thomas the tanner has finished his watch and retreated somewhere. Marjorie the alewife has counted her coins and gone to bed. The apothecary's candle, the beeswax one, burning clean and bright, has finally in the last hour been snuffed. But up here on the hill the cycle continues as it has continued every night for generations. At 2 o'clock the bell will ring, the monks will rise, the cold chapel will fill with sound. And somewhere in the town below a woman lying awake in the dark might hear it, the faint matins bell carrying down the hill on the winter air, and feel something that she might not be able to name precisely. Not comfort exactly, not safety. Something more like the knowledge that somewhere in the dark someone is paying attention. Someone is keeping watch in a way that has nothing to do with a stick and a lantern. Someone is awake on behalf of everyone who is asleep. I want to end our time at the monastery with something that I think changes how you see the whole institution once you know it. By the early 14th century, the period of our evening monasteries in England were at the height of their wealth and influence. There were at that time approximately 500 different monastic houses in England alone. 500! And within a generation of the moment we're describing, something was coming that would change all of that forever. In the year 1348, roughly 10 years after our quiet evening, the Black Death arrived in England. It moved through the country at terrifying speed. And monasteries, because they were communities of people living in close quarters, sharing spaces, sharing meals, sharing the chapel air at matins and vespers and compline, were particularly vulnerable. Some monasteries lost more than half their monks within a single year. The rich libraries were still there. The stone buildings were still there. The bell still rang for the canonical hours. But in some places there were not enough living monks left to sing the hours with a full choir. They sang anyway with fewer voices, because the psalms do not require a full choir. They require only the willingness to show up. The matins bell will ring at 2 in the morning. But before it does, before the monastery draws us back into its particular world of prayer and silence and centuries-old discipline, our evening has one more destination. Something that the town has been keeping in reserve, visible from the lane, from the market square, from every elevation in the town, but that we have not yet entered. The place at the top of the hill on the other side, where the fire in the great hearth is still burning, where the last cups of wine are being poured, where the hierarchy of the outside world is on full display even at this late hour. The castle has been watching over this town all evening, and behind its walls the night is just getting interesting. If the monastery was the town's sole watchful ancient singing in the dark on behalf of everyone who could not, then the castle was its spine. Everything about it said power lives here. From down in the lanes you could not see the castle clearly. The town's own buildings blocked it, but you always knew it was there. You could feel the weight of it on the hill above you. The stone walls thick enough to absorb cannonballs, the great hall tower visible above every roof line on clear days, the banners marking whether the Lord was in residence or away on the king's business. Tonight he is in residence, and the great hall windows high in the wall are lit, not with rushlight, not with tallow, with the unmistakable clean multiple candle brightness of beeswax. The castle's evening has been going on for hours, and it is nothing like the rest of this town's night. Let me take you back to something we noted earlier and look at it from the other side. When we talked about the food, that ordinary people ate the pottage, the dark bread, the modest supper by a covered hearth, I mentioned that the distance between a peasant's table and a lord's table was not simply a matter of quantity. It was a different world. In the great hall of a medieval castle on a decent evening, and by decent I mean any evening where there were guests, which was frequent, because hospitality was not optional for the nobility, It was a moral and political obligation. The scene was something that would genuinely astonish most people if they could see it. 3 courses, sometimes 4, each course containing multiple dishes served simultaneously piled on silver and pewter plates, roasted venison from the deer park, which was the Lord's private hunting ground, and which no commoner could touch without serious legal consequence. Swan. Yes, roasted swan served with its feathers, reattached as decoration, because in medieval England swans were crown property, and only those granted royal license could eat them, which meant a roasted swan on the table was not just dinner, it was a statement. A statement that said we have the kind of connections that allow us to eat things you are literally not permitted to eat. Peacock similarly roasted and then dressed in its own iridescent feathers, and set back together so convincingly that it appeared alive. The cooks who managed this were skilled and they knew it. Spiced wines, imported, from Bordeaux mostly brought by ship at considerable cost, and sugar. In the 14th century, sugar was not the ordinary household staple it became 500 years later. It was a luxury import from the Arab world, expensive enough that it appeared most often not as an ingredient in cooking, but as a material for sculpture. Elaborate centerpieces made from moulded coloured sugar called subtleties were placed on the high table as displays of wealth. You ate them at the end of the meal if you were important enough to be seated close enough to reach them. The seating arrangement in the great hall told you everything about where you stood. At one end, raised on a dais, a low platform that literally elevated the most important people above everyone else, was the high table. The Lord, his lady, their most honoured guests, under a fabric canopy above their heads that announced without words that these were not ordinary people sitting at an ordinary table. In front of each person at the high table their own individual trencher, their own cup, their own salt cellar, and the further down the hall you went, the less of this individual service you received. Shared trenchers, shared cups, and below a certain point below the great salt cellar that sat in the middle of the hall, the food itself was different. The expression below the salt, which we still use today to mean someone of the lower standing, was a precise physical reality in the medieval Great Hall. The salt cellar was expensive, ornate, and placed at the midpoint of the long table. Those above it were the honoured guests, those below it were the lesser company. The food that reached the bottom of the table was whatever was left served after the high table had taken the best of each course. You could read the entire social hierarchy of a medieval household by walking from the dais end to the door end of the great hall and watching how the table changed as you went. Now let me tell you about the entertainment, because this is where the castle's evening becomes genuinely alive. While the household ate, the hall was not quiet. At one end, near the screen's passage that separated the hall from the kitchens, stood or sat the minstrel, sometimes a single musician with a lute. At larger feasts, a small group lute flute, perhaps a drummer vocalist. The music was continuous through the meal, filling the stone space with sound that competed with the general noise of several dozen people eating and talking at the same time. The songs they sang were not the Gregorian plainchant rising from the monastery on the hill. These were ballads, stories of love and war and adventure set to melodies that people in the hall already half knew. The same story could run for an hour if the audience was generous with their cups and the minstrel judged the room correctly. And periodically, between courses, the entertainment escalated. A jester, performing physical comedy acrobatics tricks, wordplay designed to make the Lord laugh in front of his guests, which was itself a performance of the Lord's own generosity and good humour. On grander occasions, jugglers, fire-eaters, dancers, and on the very grandest occasions, royal visits, major feast days, something called an entremet, a theatrical performance inserted between courses, sometimes with costumes, sometimes with mechanical devices, sometimes involving live animals. The ambition of these performances was extraordinary. Historical records describe mechanical fountains, moving figures, elaborate allegories, performed by the castle's own household members. One account from 14th century France describes an entremet in which a full-scale ship was constructed inside a great hall and appeared to sail across the floor, crewed by actors in costume, trailing what appeared to be ocean in the rushes. The medieval lord did not simply eat dinner, he staged it. But here is the part of castle life that I find most fascinating, and the part that most modern people never think about at all. The bedchamber. Let me ask you something. Where is the most private place in your home? The place where you can genuinely be alone, or nearly alone with the people you trust most? For most of us, that answer probably involves a bedroom. A space that is yours, that is separate from the rest of the world, that closes behind a door. Now, in a 14th century castle, what was the most private place in the building? The answer, somewhat paradoxically, is the Lord's bedchamber. The great hall was public feasts, courts, audiences, the constant presence of servants, retainers, guests, petitioners. The solar, the private sitting room, was semi-private. But the bedchamber with access, controlled by the chamberlain and the innermost ring of servants, was where genuinely confidential matters were discussed. Councils of war were held at the bedside. Political alliances were negotiated in the private chamber. Letters were dictated there. Confessions were sometimes heard there. The most important conversations of a lord's political life happened not in the great hall, but in the room where the great bed stood. The bed itself was a statement of extraordinary ambition. In the 14th century, for a household of significant wealth, the great bed was a four-poster construction with a canopy above and heavy curtains on all four sides. When the curtains were drawn, the interior of the bed was as close to a private room within a room as medieval architecture could construct. The curtains embroidered with the family's heraldic device, lined with velvet or damask in crimson, or deep blue or forest green edged with imported fur, were among the most valuable objects in the entire castle. Beds and their furnishings appear regularly in medieval wills. They were passed down through generations. They were given as diplomatic gifts. The great bed was not furniture, it was heritage. A description from a 14th century English poem, The Tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, gives us one of the most vivid accounts of what a noble bedchamber looked like at its finest. The curtains of pure silk hemmed with gold, the bedspreads lined above in bright fur, the curtains running on ropes with rings of red gold. The poem is fiction, but the details are documentary. The poet was describing something his audience knew. Now here is the detail I want you to really sit with, because it contradicts everything the modern mind assumes about noble privacy. Nobody in a medieval castle slept alone, not the lord, not the lady, not the honoured guest. The great bed was large enough, deliberately large enough to accommodate multiple people. Not just the married couple, but on significant occasions important guests who would be offered the honour of sharing the lord's own bed rather than sleeping on a pallet in the hall. To be invited to sleep in the lord's bed was not odd. It was an honour, a political signal, a mark of trust. And beyond the bed itself, in the same room or in the antechamber just outside the door, slept the personal servants. The chamberlain on a pallet near the door, light enough sleeping that any movement would wake him. The lady's closest attendant on the floor near the curtained bed. A page somewhere nearby tasked with keeping the night fire. Because the stone castle was genuinely relentlessly cold, even with tapestries on the walls hung specifically to prevent cold air seeping through the stone, even with a stone fireplace rather than the open central hearth of the great hall. Even with the bed curtains drawn and the furs piled up over the feather mattress, a medieval castle bedchamber in winter was cold enough that your breath misted in the air even inside the curtains. This is why every evening before the Lord and Lady retired, one of the most important rituals in the castle's private life was performed. A servant, typically a junior member of the household, would take a brass warming pan, a shallow pan, on a long handle filled with hot coals from the fire, and slide it back and forth between the sheets of the great bed. Back and forth, slowly, methodically, until the cold linen was warmed and the feather mattress had absorbed some heat from the pan, and the vast cold cave of the interior of the bed had been persuaded into something approaching comfort. Only then was the lord or lady invited to enter, and here is one more detail that I cannot resist sharing. Medieval nobles did not lie flat to sleep. They slept semi-upright, propped against pillows and bolsters, at an angle that no modern person would find comfortable for more than a few minutes. And the reason that was cited at the time and which appears in various records and accounts was superstition. Lying completely flat, completely horizontal, was the posture of the dead, of a body laid out for burial, of someone who had given up the fight. The belief was not precisely theological. It was more instinctive than that. A sleeping person lying prone fully horizontal was in some murky, half-articulated sense too close to death, too easy for whatever moved through the night to mistake for someone already on the other side. So the nobility of 14th century England slept sitting up more or less, propped, alert at least in posture against whatever the night might bring. And what it might bring, what the darkness between the drawn bed curtains could contain, what moved through the castle corridors after the last candle was snuffed and the fire burned low, was exactly the kind of thing that the medieval mind never quite managed to completely dismiss, even here, even in the most fortified, best-lit, most powerfully protected building in the district. The night still got in. Let me tell you what happened in the great hall after the feast was finished. The trestle tables were taken down. Medieval tables were literally boards placed on trestles and removed after each meal because the great hall served too many functions to be permanently occupied by dining furniture. Fresh rushes might be scattered if the old ones were too far gone. And then the hall transformed into something else entirely, a sleeping space. In the 14th century, for a household of any size, dozens of people slept in the great hall every night. Servants, retainers, men-at-arms, guests of middling importance who warranted a place inside the walls but not a chamber of their own. They arranged themselves on the floor or on the benches along the walls or on pallets that were stored during the day and rolled out at night. Those nearest the fire were warm. Those further away were cold. Those who had brought good wool blankets were comfortable. Those who had not made do with their cloaks. The hall went quiet eventually. The fire burned lower. The dogs settled in their preferred spots near the embers. The last of the wine was drunk. And in the private chamber above the great hall, behind the thick door, behind the curtained bed, attended by sleeping servants on the floor, the lord and lady lay propped against their bolsters in the dark. Not the dark of the peasant's hut, where darkness was simply the absence of light. This dark was richer, thick with tapestry and fur and the smell of beeswax and spiced wine, and the particular warmth of multiple bodies in a confined stone space, but dark nonetheless. I want to say something here that I believe is true, but that is rarely said directly about the medieval nobility. For all the feasts, for all the minstrels and the swan and the sugar sculptures and the embroidered bed curtains and the warming pans, for all the distance between the high table and the cold floor of the great hall, for all the ceremony and the status and the accumulated luxury of the most powerful household in this town, when the candles went out and the curtains were drawn and the night settled in, the lord was afraid of the same dark as everyone else. He lay semi-upright because lying flat was the posture of the dead. He kept a servant in the room because no one in the 14th century of any class slept entirely alone if they could help it. and the beliefs that governed what lived in the darkness between 3 and 4 in the morning did not stop at the castle gate. They came inside. They were believed by the educated and the superstitious alike, by monks and merchants and lords. Because the night in the medieval world did not discriminate, it came for everyone equally, and what people genuinely believed moved through that darkness. What stories were told, what precautions were taken, what sounds heard from outside the walls on a winter night, made even the most powerful lord's servants pull their cloaks tighter and not look out the window. That is a story that belongs to the whole town. To every person in every bed, from the straw pallet on the floor of the alehouse to the feathered mattress behind the embroidered curtains on the hill. And it begins, as all the best stories do, with something that cannot quite be explained. Something moving in the dark, something that has been moving in the dark since long before this town existed, and will continue long after the stones of this castle have become a meadow and been forgotten. Let me stop for a second and ask you something personal. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, completely suddenly, eyes open wide, and felt with absolute certainty that something was in the room with you? Not a sound that startled you, not the cat, not your imagination running warm from a dream. Something that felt present, real, standing in the corner or beside the bed or just outside the frame of what you could see. And even if your rational mind said in its calm, reasonable morning will come voice that there is nothing there, your body disagreed entirely. Your heart was going, your breath had gone shallow, and the darkness felt thicker than it had any right to be. If that has ever happened to you, you already know something important about the medieval night. You know it from the inside, because the medieval world was not simply a darker, poorer, less connected version of our world. It was a world in which the experiences I just described, that sudden waking, that sensation of presence, the feeling that the night contained things that did not belong to the living, were not dismissed as tricks of a tired brain. They were taken as evidence of a world that ran parallel to the visible one, a world of spirits, of restless dead, of creatures that move through the dark on their own errands, a world that the church, the folk tradition, the medical theorists, and the person lying awake in a cold house at 2 o'clock in the morning all agreed, despite disagreeing about almost everything else, was absolutely, certainly, frighteningly real. Let me take you to the night sky above our town. It is deep winter now, let us say December, the long dark months when sunset comes so early and dawn comes so late that the night seems to swallow the day like something hungry. The curfew bell rang hours ago. The watchman has done his rounds. The apothecary's candle has finally gone out. The monastery bells have rung compline, then matins, then the long silence of lords. The town is asleep, and overhead the sky, genuinely, brilliantly, magnificently dark in a way that few people alive today have ever seen, is crackling with stars. No light pollution, no orange haze from street lamps reflecting off cloud cover. Just the Milky Way blazing overhead like a river of cold fire, and the sound of wind moving through the thatch. And then a sound. Out beyond the walls, out where the roads run between the bare winter fields and the edges of the forest, someone claims to have heard it. Horns. Not the horn of the watchman. Not a huntsman setting out at dawn. Something else. A distant horn, and beneath it the baying of hounds, not one or two but dozens, a sound that rises and falls on the wind and does not seem to come from any fixed direction. And then impossibly the sound of hoofbeats, not on the road, above it, moving through the sky. The medieval world had a name for this, the wild hunt. And if you heard it, if you were unlucky enough to be outside on a winter night and the sound came toward you, the instruction from every source in every country was clear and unanimous. Get down, lie flat on the ground, do not look up, do not run, do not speak. Because if the hunt passed over you and you remained low, you might survive the encounter. But if you were standing, if you were seen, the hunt might take you with it. And those who were taken were not necessarily killed. They were simply gone. Gone for a night that somehow stretched into a year. Gone for a century that felt like an evening. Gone into whatever place the hunt came from, and returned, if at all, to a world where everyone they knew had aged or died. The wild hunt is one of those beliefs that leaves modern scholars in a genuinely interesting position, because it is documented seriously, formally documented across more than 1,000 years and half a continent. In England it was known by multiple names: Hurler's Assembly, Woden's Hunt, Gabriel's Hounds in the north of the country. In Germany it was the Wilde Jagd, the Wild Army. In Scandinavia it was associated with Odin and his warriors, the fallen dead riding through the winter sky. Its leader changed depending on the teller. Sometimes it was a pagan god. Sometimes a legendary king in England, sometimes the ghost of King Arthur himself, not sleeping in Avalon, but riding in fury through the cold winter dark. In later medieval stories, the leader was sometimes the devil, sometimes a figure no one could name, but the core of the experience, the horns, the hounds, the impossible sky riding, the terrible danger of being seen remained remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other. A 9th century document written by the Abbot of Prum mentions it. Bishop Burchard of Worms, writing in the year 1066, condemned the belief as a vestige of dangerous paganism that was still flourishing in his day. A 13th century sermon by Berthold of Regensburg confirms that ordinary people still believed in it, and still left tables set with food for the supernatural women who rode with the hunt. The church found it exhausting. They kept condemning it. People kept believing in it anyway. Now, where did this belief come from? I want to be careful here because there are two tempting oversimplifications and neither of them is quite right. The first is to say it was all just ignorance. People did not understand weather or migrating birds or optical illusions, so they invented supernatural explanations for what they saw and heard. The second is to say something real was being reported. There was a genuine tradition of night riding ceremonies or ritual processions or something experienced and remembered in ways our modern framework does not accommodate. The honest answer is somewhere in the middle, and it is more interesting than either extreme. Historians like Ronald Hutton have noted that the wild hunt legends probably have multiple origins layered on top of each other across centuries. Some elements likely come from genuine pre-Christian beliefs about Odin and the dead. Some were almost certainly shaped by the Christian concept of purgatory, these souls of the unquiet dead, unable to rest riding endlessly until their sins were purged. Some may reflect real disturbing experiences that people had outdoors at night in conditions we can partially understand unusual meteorological phenomena. The eerie atmospheric effects of certain winter nights, sounds that carry and distort across open landscapes in ways that feel inexplicable. And some, I think most honest researchers would concede this came from the human mind doing what the human mind has always done in the dark, making shapes, making meaning, filling the silence with something that explains why the silence feels wrong. The will-o'-the-wisp is the gentler cousin of the wild hunt. If you walked at night near marshland, and much of medieval England and France was marshy, poorly drained, the kind of ground that breathed cold fog on still evenings, you might see it. A small flickering light, bluish or pale gold, hovering just above the ground, moving in a way that suggested intent. Moving when you walk toward it, just ahead of you. Always just ahead. In English folklore, it was most often the soul of someone who'd been wicked in life condemned to wander the marshes forever. Sometimes it was a malicious spirit deliberately luring the lost traveller deeper into the bog. In French, it was the feu follet, the foolish fire. In Latin, the ignis fatuus, the same. Foolish because it led the foolish to follow it, and the foolish who followed it into a marsh at night did not always come back out, Modern science has a perfectly functional explanation for the will-o'-the-wisp. Marshy ground produces methane and phosphine gas as organic material decomposes. Under certain atmospheric conditions, these gases can ignite spontaneously, creating small, brief dancing flames at ground level or just above it. Phosphine especially can produce a faint, eerie glow, even without fully combusting. So cold, marshy night, still air decomposing vegetation trace amounts of spontaneously igniting gas. That is the will-o'-the-wisp. And knowing that, do you find it less strange? I genuinely don't. Because standing in a medieval marsh on a moonless night, watching a pale light drift ahead of you through the reeds, hearing nothing but your own heartbeat and the sound of water moving under the mud, I think you might find the scientific explanation a little cold comfort. The light moves like it knows where it's going. Now let us go back inside. Back to the room where someone in this town is lying in their bed somewhere between waking and sleeping in the deep of the night. They have been here before, not this specific night, but this specific feeling, the heaviness that settles on the chest without any cause they can name, the sense that they are awake, completely certainly awake, and that they cannot move, arms that will not lift, legs that will not shift, a body that is theirs and somehow also not theirs, held in place by something that has no shape but has weight. And in the corner of the room, or beside the bed, or leaning over them in the dark, something, not a dream. They know the difference between sleeping and waking. They have been awake their whole life. This is waking, and this thing is there. In the medieval world, this experience had a well-established name and a well-established explanation. The nightmare, and I mean that word in its original sense, not the modern one. The Old English word mare, which gives us the second half of the word nightmare, referred to a female evil spirit that was believed to lie upon sleeping people and press the breath from their bodies. In Scandinavian tradition, it was the mara. In Latin medical texts, it was called the incubus, or the ephialtes, literally what climbs upon. The experience was so consistent, so widely reported, so clearly real, to so many people across so many centuries, that it had its own entry in medieval medical textbooks. And here is the remarkable thing. Medieval physicians, the learned ones trained at Salerno and Montpellier, did not believe it was a demon. They thought it was indigestion. I say that with affection, not mockery. Their explanation was that overeating before sleep caused vapours to rise from the stomach to the brain, producing the sensation of weight on the chest and the hallucinated presence. Completely wrong in its mechanism. Completely right in insisting that the experience had a natural rather than supernatural cause. The actual explanation, which was not formalized until the 20th century, is sleep paralysis. When we enter the deepest phase of sleep, our brains temporarily paralyze our muscles to prevent us from physically acting out our dreams. This is normal and necessary, but occasionally a person wakes up, becomes conscious while this paralysis is still active. They are awake. They know they are awake. They cannot move. And the brain, firing in a half-dreaming state, generates an explanation for the paralysis. The explanation it generates almost universally across cultures, across centuries, in people who have never heard of sleep paralysis and have no shared cultural framework, is that something is holding them down. Approximately 8% of people experience sleep paralysis at some point in their lives. 8%. In a town of 4,000 medieval souls that is 320 people, who have at some point lain awake in the dark, completely unable to move, absolutely certain that something was in the room with them. 320 people for whom the darkness was not just dark. A 12th century miracle story from Canterbury tells of a knight named Stephen of Hoyland who had suffered from terrifying night attacks for 30 years, episodes in which he felt a demon crushing and suffocating him, and begged his servants to wake him immediately, to sit him upright, to pull his hair, to rouse him. The author of the story describes Stephen's physicians diagnosing him with ephialtes, the medical term, not the supernatural one. They told him it was a disease, a natural condition. Stephen rejected their diagnosis absolutely. He remained convinced until his dying day that what visited him at night was a demon. This is the thing that stays with me about medieval fear of the dark. It was not simply ignorance. It was an interpretation of genuine experience. Something was happening. The experience was real. The body that could not move the presence in the corner, the weight on the chest, these were not invented or exaggerated. They happened exactly as people described. The explanation was wrong, but the experience was not. And then there are the ghosts, not the flickering Hollywood kind. The medieval kind, which were a good deal more specific and considerably more demanding. In the medieval understanding of the afterlife, a soul that died with unfinished business, without proper burial rites, without confession, without resolution of some earthly obligation, did not simply fade away. It returned. These returned souls were called revenants from the French word for one who comes back. And unlike the vague, translucent spirits of popular imagination, medieval revenants were often described as fully physical, heavy, audible, sometimes visible, sometimes not, but almost always felt in the weight of their presence, in the drop in temperature that accompanied them, in the sound of their particular way of moving. The souls most likely to return were those who had died in specific circumstances, sudden, unprepared death. Burial without proper rites, suicide, death in childbirth, those who had debts that were never settled, or wrongdoings that were never confessed, or messages that were never delivered. These were the restless dead, and the way to deal with the haunting, the practical community understood method, was not prayer alone, though prayer helped. It was the intervention of a priest who would hear the ghost's confession, learn what it needed, and provide it. Because what most medieval ghosts wanted, according to the documents and stories that survive, was not to frighten. They wanted to communicate. They had something to say, something to request, something to put right. They were the unfinished business of the living, walking back through the walls of the house in the middle of the night to knock on the door. I find this interpretation, whatever you make of its literal accuracy, extraordinarily human. The medieval dead were not threatening. They were needy. They came back because they were not done yet. And what does modern science say about all of this, not to debunk it? I want to be clear about that because I think the instinct to debunk medieval fear is a failure of empathy more than a triumph of reason. But to understand it, the darkness that medieval people experienced was genuine. The isolation was genuine. The absence of explanation for a world full of real events that seemed random and cruel, disease, sudden death, crop failure, fire, was genuine. When your neighbour falls sick for no reason, anyone can identify and dies in 3 days, and you have no framework of germ theory, no understanding of how infection spreads. You reach for the framework that is available to you. Was someone angry at him? Did he encounter something on the road at night? Did his burial rites from 2 years ago, when his wife died, get done correctly? These are not stupid questions. They are the best available questions within the available framework, and the fact that the darkness felt inhabited, felt genuinely physically thick with presence, was not a cultural delusion. Sleep paralysis was real. Phosphine in the marshes was real. The acoustic properties of certain winter nights carrying sound in ways that seem impossible were real. The psychological weight of living in a world without explanations, without control, without any ability to predict whether this winter would be survivable or not, that weight was real. The medieval night was frightening because the medieval night was genuinely frightening. Not because people were credulous, because the dark, when it is truly dark, has always done something to the human mind. Something very old. something that no amount of electric light has entirely turned off. The fires are covered, the lanes are empty, the wild hunt. If it rides tonight, rides somewhere beyond the walls and far away, and somewhere in this town 4,000 people are breathing in the dark. Some of them are sleeping peacefully, some of them are lying awake listening to the sound of the wind, and at least a few of them, the ones who know what the night can do, have their herbs hanging in the window and their horseshoe above the door, just in case. Because in the medieval mind, and perhaps in a part of ours that we've simply agreed to keep quiet, the darkness between 3 and 4 in the morning is not the same darkness as midnight. It is older, it feels different, it knows things. And the reason why, the deep biological, truly ancient reason why the human brain treats the hours before dawn as a different country entirely, is something that turns out to be far stranger and more beautiful than any ghost story. Because we are about to discover that medieval people did not sleep the way you and I sleep. They split the night in half on purpose. And what they did in the space between their two sleeps, that quiet candlelit interval at the hinge of the night, is the most unexpected and quietly moving thing we have found on this whole long journey through the dark. We have been walking through the dark together for a long time now, through the market square as it emptied, through the curfew bell's resonance and the fire-scarred lessons of towns that did not listen to it, through the alehouse and the watchman's rounds and the apothecary's careful candlelight, past the monastery on the hill where the singing never fully stops, through the castle where power sleeps semi-upright behind embroidered curtains, and through the extraordinary darkness that stretched between shuttered buildings and bred the wildest fears the human imagination has ever produced. And now finally we arrive at the strangest discovery of all, the one that begins not with what medieval people believed about the night, but with what they actually did in it. The one that will genuinely change how you think about sleep. Yours and everyone else's. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment before I answer it. When was the last time you woke up naturally in the middle of the night, not because of a sound, not because of a dream, not because you needed the bathroom, but simply because your body decided that one sleep was finished, and it was time to be awake for a while? And when that happened, did you feel a flutter of anxiety? Did you lie there calculating how many hours remained until the alarm, feeling the minutes tick by as a kind of small failure? If so, you are not alone. And according to one of the most startling discoveries in the history of sleep research, you're not broken. You're simply operating like a pre-industrial human whose internal rhythm has briefly temporarily pierced through the modern expectation layered over it. Let me explain. In the year 2001, a historian named A. Roger Kirch at Virginia Tech University published a research paper that caused a quiet revolution in how scholars thought about night. He had spent 16 years searching through historical sources, diaries, legal records, medical texts, literature prayer books, court depositions, letters across multiple languages and multiple centuries. And in document after document, in language after language, spanning from ancient Greece through Rome, through the medieval period and into the early modern era, he kept finding the same phrase. First sleep. A 9-year-old girl's court deposition from 1697 describing her mother waking after her first sleep to go out. A medical text from the 15th century advising patients to lie on their right side during the first sleep, and after the first sleep to turn onto the left side for better digestion. A French physician in the 16th century recommending that married couples conduct intimate relations between the first and second sleeps, because as he put it with admirable specificity, they would have more enjoyment and do it better. Geoffrey Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales describing a character who slept soon after evening fell, then awoke in the early morning following her first sleep. Her companions, who had stayed up much later, slept straight through until fully prime the dawn hour. More than 500 references in published form, Since then, Kirch has identified more than 2,000 in a dozen languages, going back as far as Thucydides in ancient Greece, who used the phrase apoprotou after the first sleep. The first sleep. Because there was a second. Here is what human sleep actually looked like before the Industrial Revolution changed everything. People went to bed not long after dark, usually between 8 and 9 in the evening, when the curfew bell had rung and the fire was covered and there was nothing useful left to do by any available light. They slept. Deeply, genuinely the kind of sleep that modern insomniacs dream about, for roughly 3 to 4 hours, and then around midnight they woke up, naturally, quietly, without alarm or distress. The waking period, called the watch in some historical sources, lasted somewhere between 1 and 3 hours, and in that interval, in the dark and quiet of the deep night, medieval people did something that I find almost impossibly lovely. They lived a private life that the daytime did not permit. What happened during the watch? The answer from the historical sources is all kinds of things. Some people prayed. The matins bell ringing at 2 in the morning from the monastery on the hill was not disrupting anyone's sleep. It was for many people arriving precisely at the moment they were already awake. The waking period between first and second sleep was in fact the ideal time for religious contemplation. The darkness was profound, the household was quiet, and the mind was in what researchers who have studied this phenomenon describe as a state of unusual calm. A scientific experiment conducted in the early 1990s by researcher Thomas Ware at the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States recreated pre-industrial light conditions by depriving subjects of artificial light at night for several weeks. After an initial period of catching up on sleep debt, the subjects began sleeping in 2 segments, with a waking period of 1 to 3 hours in between. And here is what the hormone data showed during that midnight waking period. The subjects had unusually low levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, and elevated levels of prolactin, a hormone associated with calm meditative states. Ware described the state his subjects entered during the watch as an altered state of consciousness not unlike meditation, not anxiety, not insomnia, something closer to the opposite of both. Some people used the watch for quiet conversation with whoever was beside them. The historian notes that husbands and wives would use this interval to talk, genuinely talk in a way that the busyness and public nature of the daytime household did not permit. This was their private time, the hour that belonged only to them. Some people read if they had a candle and something to read. Some people peeled rushes for the next day's lighting, or checked the coals, or planned the morning's work. Some people visited neighbours, yes, genuinely walked to a neighbour's house in the dark of the night if the need was significant enough. And some people simply lay awake in the particular quality of calm that belonged to the middle of a medieval night, in a way that none of us now lying anxious in the dark at 3 in the morning with our phones face down on the nightstand can quite access. This is where the 2 sleeps meet the wild hunt. Because when we talked about the fears of the medieval night, the things that moved in the darkness, the sleep paralysis, the sense of presence in the corner of the room, we were talking about a population that was spending a significant portion of every single night awake in the dark. Not reluctantly awake, not anxiously awake. Awake in the way that the body knows how to be awake when artificial light is not constantly fooling it into staying up, and when the expectation of 8 continuous hours has not been installed as the measure of adequate rest. Genuinely, naturally, calmly awake, and in that state with prolactin high and cortisol low, in a darkness more complete than anything we ever experience in a silence broken only by the monastery bell, and the distant call of the watchman, the medieval mind did what minds in that state tend to do. It drifted. It contemplated. It dreamed while technically awake. And the line between the waking world and whatever lay on the other side of it was genuinely thinner than it is in the morning, I want to tell you something that I believe is one of the most important things in this entire evening. When Roger Kirch's research began to spread beyond academia and reach ordinary people, people who woke at 2 in the morning and lay there calculating the hours and feeling like failures at something as basic as sleep, what happened was extraordinary. People wrote to him, hundreds of them, saying essentially, "You have described my experience exactly, and now I understand it is not a disorder. Now I understand that this calm wakefulness is not insomnia. Now I understand that my body is doing something ancient and natural and correct, and the only thing wrong is the anxiety I layered on top of it because the modern world told me it was wrong." Russell Foster, a professor of circadian neuroscience at Oxford University, put it, plainly, many people wake up at night and panic. He tells them that what they are experiencing is a throwback to the biphasic sleep pattern that was standard for most of human history. It is not broken, he says, it is just old, and so slowly the medieval night is beginning to end, not suddenly, not with a crack of light, but with a gradual softening of the dark above the rooftops in the east that begins so subtly you might almost miss it. The watch is ending. Across the town, the people who've been lying in the quiet of the waking interval are beginning to feel the second pull of sleep. The particular heaviness that comes back when the watch is done drawing them under again. Not the full-bodied plunge of first sleep, but something gentler, a completing. The woman who spent the last hour lying still beside her husband, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once, closes her eyes. The man who got up to check the coals and found them good, and sat for a while in the dark just listening to the sound of the town at its quietest shuffles back to his pallet. In the great hall of the castle, the bodies arranged on the floor are already in their second sleep, breathing slowly, the dogs still. In the monastery, Matins has finished, and the monks have returned to their dormitory, and the rule of St. Benedict permits them a second sleep before Lauds at dawn. Even the watchman, wherever he is, whatever corner of the town wall, or whatever borrowed warmth he has found, has stopped walking. The second sleep is the shorter one. It ends with dawn, and dawn in the medieval world does not arrive silently. The prime bell is the first sound of a new day. Prime the hour of sunrise, the first of the daytime offices, corresponding roughly to 6 in the morning in our season rings from the church, just as the sky in the east turns from grey to pale gold. And the town's response to this bell is something genuinely extraordinary to witness if you have been awake in the dark long enough to see it. The gates open, not all at once, not with a ceremonial flourish, but the gatekeepers who have been awake and waiting draw back the heavy iron bolts and push the wooden doors outward into the morning air, and the town connects to the world again after a night of isolation. Within minutes, the lanes that were silent an hour ago are filling with sound. The baker's fire, which was kept from full extinction all night, is being coaxed into full flame. A cartwheel rolls on cobblestone somewhere. A dog barks. A child is already making noise that no one can quite identify. The market square, which at midnight was as still and empty as the surface of a pond, begins to fill again with the irregular traffic of human life. And standing at the centre of it, all watching the town come back to itself, you might feel something that is hard to name precisely. Something like this is where we started. The light is different now, coming from the other direction, coming warm from the east rather than fading red in the west. The chill is deeper, but the basic fact is the same. A town of 4,000 souls making its way through another day. I want to tell you what I find most moving about everything we have seen tonight. Not the grand things, not the fires or the feasts or the singing monks, the small things. The woman who carefully checked her terracotta fire dome for the 3rd time before she went to sleep because she'd heard what fire could do. The tanner doing his civic duty in the dark with a stick and a lantern, calling the hours so everyone else could sleep without worrying. Marjorie the alewife counting her coins at the end of a long night. Her fingers practised her face tired and completely unsentimental. The monk in the scriptorium who had been sitting at his sloped desk since before you were born, copying down words that would outlast him by centuries. The medieval person lying in the dark during the watch, not anxious, not broken, just awake in the particular way that the body knows how to be awake when the world is not pushing it to be anything else. What moves me about all of this is how recognizable it is, how human. We think of the medieval world as distant, incomprehensible, separated from us by 700 years of change and progress and accumulated knowledge, and in some ways it is. But at 3 a.m, when the fires are covered and the town is quiet and someone you love is breathing beside you in the dark, the distance collapses. The medieval woman checking her coals one more time and the person listening to this story right now are the same animal facing the same dark, carrying the same ancient rhythms in their biology. The world around us has changed beyond recognition. We have not. And now let me say the last thing. The thing I think this whole long evening has been quietly building toward. The medieval night was frightening, genuinely, physically, practically frightening in ways that ours is not. The dark was darker, the cold was colder, the threats were more immediate and less predictable. But the medieval night was also, and this is what I believe the evidence shows clearly, more inhabited. Not by ghosts, not by the wild hunt, by people, by community, by the collective human experience of being awake in the dark together with the monastery bell keeping the hours and the watchman's lantern, moving through the lanes and the fire covered under its dome waiting for morning. We have traded that inhabited darkness for something that is objectively safer and more comfortable and infinitely more lit. And I think sometimes we miss something about the old way without quite knowing what it is. We miss the watch. We miss the sense that the night is a country with its own rhythms and rules that deserves to be respected rather than simply overwhelmed. We miss waking in the dark and feeling not panic, but the quiet, specific calm of a body at rest between two sleeps. The prime bell rings, the gates open, the town begins again. And if you are still here, still listening, still somewhere in the comfortable dark of your own evening, then you have done something tonight that medieval people did every single night. You have kept the watch. You have stayed awake in the dark when everything else went quiet. And in the morning when the light comes back and the day begins again, you will carry a little of this with you. The knowledge that your midnight waking is ancient, that the dark has always been inhabited, that every town that has ever existed has had someone in the lanes keeping the hours so that everyone else could sleep, that even the most frightening night eventually gives way to the sound of gates opening and a cartwheel on cobblestone and a child making that particular noise that no one can quite identify. Dawn, again, as it has always been. Sleep well.